My name is Adriana Perry, and I was 22 on the morning of my college graduation when my parents took me to lunch to tell me I was adopted. My mother Brenda smiled as she set a small wrapped box on the table and told me they had only kept me around for the financial benefits. She said I was useless to them now. My father Richard slid a stack of legal papers across the white tablecloth. He told me they had already filed to cut me out of the family trust and their estate. I did not cry. I did not raise my voice. I took a sip of water and told them it was funny they brought this up today. I told them I had found my birth family 6 months ago and that they were currently sitting at the table directly behind my mother. My mother had not turned around yet. What happened when she finally rotated her chair is the reason I am sharing this story today. When my father slid the paperwork across the table, he did it with the practiced ease of a man paying a restaurant check. He tapped the top page with his index finger and instructed me to sign the waiver on the bottom line. The waiver would forfeit my rights to anything bearing the Perry family name. My mother folded her hands over her expensive silk blouse and watched my face. She was waiting for the tears. She had orchestrated this entire lunch around the assumption that I would break down and beg for my place in their lives. She wanted the satisfaction of watching me crumble in a public setting where I would be forced to keep my voice down. I looked at the pen resting next to my water glass. I looked at the small box my mother had presented as a graduation gift. I knew the box was empty before she even admitted it. It was a prop. This entire lunch was a prop. I left the pen on the table. I leaned forward and delivered my response with the cold precision of an auditor finding a fatal error in a ledger. I told her about the birth family she never thought I would find. I told her about Table 4. Welcome back to Senior Echo Stories, where we share real family narratives about finding your worth and building a life without the people who tried to break you. If you have ever had to audit your own childhood to understand your value, this story is for you. Drop your location in the comments and make sure to subscribe. The restaurant was a high-end dining room located a few miles off the university campus in Pennsylvania. I had never been invited to a place like this by my parents. The mahogany doors opened into a quiet room filled with soft lighting and the low hum of expensive conversations. My mother chose the location. That should have been my first clue because Brenda Perry did not spend money on me without a clear return on her investment printed somewhere on a receipt. When I approached the hostess stand, the woman asked for the reservation name. My father had booked the table under his own name instead of mentioning it was a graduation lunch for his daughter. There was no mention of a celebration. I walked through the dining room and spotted them sitting in a corner booth near the back windows. Brenda wore a silver silk blouse she reserved for board meetings and funerals. It was the same blouse she wore 5 years ago when she threatened to sue our school district over my brother getting a bad grade. She wore it when she wanted to project authority and extract compliance. Richard sat across from her wearing a tailored suit. He kept checking his watch and adjusting a dark leather portfolio resting near his water glass. The table was bare. There was no banner waiting for me. There were no balloons tied to the back of my chair. The air around their table possessed the careful politeness of people about to read a verdict. I had spent the last 4 years sitting in lecture halls and quiet library corners studying forensic accounting. My degree taught me how to read the negative space in a financial document. It taught me how to trace hidden assets and expose the lies people tell on paper. More importantly, it taught me how to read the people who draft those lies. I knew the difference between a dinner designed for celebration and a lunch designed for a severance. This had the exact temperature of a severance. I slid into the booth across from them and set my own small bag on the floor. Inside my bag was a thin manila folder. It was plain and unremarkable. My parents assumed it held a resume or copies of my diploma. They had no idea what I had placed inside it. I studied my breathing and let my eyes drift past my mother's shoulder. I scanned the dining room until I located the small brass number standing on the center of the table directly behind her. It was Table 4. I noted its position the way you mark an exit in a burning building. I held that number in my mind without giving away my focus. I knew who was going to sit there. I had arranged for them to be there. The waiter approached our table holding a leather-bound wine list. He looked at me in my graduation dress and offered a warm smile. He asked if we wanted to start with a bottle of champagne to celebrate the occasion. Richard did not even look up from his portfolio. He raised a single hand and requested 3 waters with lemon. He spoke over the waiter in a tone that dismissed the question entirely. The waiter nodded and stepped away, leaving an awkward silence hovering over the white tablecloth. Brenda reached into her purse and retrieved a small square box wrapped in silver paper. She placed it in the exact center of the table. She did not push it toward me. She placed it there as a focal point. I looked at the box, and then at her face. Brenda possessed a type of beauty that required constant maintenance and a rigid control of her expressions. She did not smile with her eyes. Her smiles were purely tactical. She used them to disarm cashiers or manipulate neighbors. Right now, her face was set in a smooth expression of polite expectation. She wanted me to reach for the box. She wanted me to perform the role of the grateful daughter. I kept my hands folded in my lap. I had learned a long time ago that accepting a gift from my mother always cost more than the item was worth. Richard finally stopped adjusting his portfolio and looked across the table. His eyes were cold and tired. He possessed the demeanor of a man who treated his family like a corporate merger that was losing profitability. He cleared his throat and adjusted his cuffs. The gestures were small, but I recognized them. My forensic accounting professors called these behavioral tells. People fidget when they are about to present falsified data. They adjust their clothing when they are preparing to defend a lie. Richard was preparing his opening statement. The silence between us stretched on for a full minute. I let it stretch. The most powerful position in any negotiation belongs to the person who does not feel the need to fill the quiet spaces. I watched the condensation form on the water glasses. I listened to the faint clinking of silverware from the surrounding tables. Behind Brenda, I saw the hostess leading a party of 3 toward table 4. I recognized the nervous posture of the older woman in the front. I saw the familiar chin of the younger woman walking behind her. They moved quietly and took their seats without drawing attention. The trap I had built over the last 6 months was finally set. My parents believed they were the architects of this afternoon. They thought they had lured me away from my peers to quietly dispose of their legal obligations on the day my university funding ended. They assumed I was blind to the financial machinations that had governed my entire life in their house. They thought I was just a naive 22-year-old girl waiting for a slice of cake and a pat on the back. They had no idea that I had spent the last semester investigating their past. They did not know that I had already read the trust documents they were trying to hide from me. Brenda tapped her polished fingernail against the small wrapped box. She tilted her head and asked me why I was being so quiet on my special day. The tone she used was identical to the tone she used when scolding me as a child. It was patronizing and laced with a subtle threat. She wanted me to speak so she could begin the process of dismantling my words. I looked at the box, and then looked directly into her eyes. I told her I was just waiting for the presentation to begin. Richard unzipped the leather portfolio. The sound of the metal zipper felt incredibly loud against the quiet backdrop of the dining room. He reached inside and pulled out a thick stack of legal documents printed on heavy bond paper. He squared the edges of the paper against the table and placed them next to the wrapped box. The top page featured the bold letterhead of a downtown law firm. The document was titled as a waiver of interest and release of claims. It was the exact type of document a company uses when they want an employee to forfeit their rights in exchange for a quiet exit. My father leaned forward and steepled his fingers. He stated that we needed to have a realistic conversation about the future. He said my graduation marked the end of their financial runway, and that it was time to formalize the separation of our lives. He spoke with the detached rhythm of an accountant reading a quarterly earnings report. There was no hesitation in his voice. There was no regret. He was simply executing a plan that had been drafted long before we ever walked into this restaurant. I kept my posture relaxed. I rested my hand on my bag near my feet where my own manila folder waited. I listened to the man who raised me explain why I was no longer a viable asset to his household. I listened to my mother prepare to deliver the lie that would shatter the illusion of our family forever. I felt the presence of the people sitting at table 4 directly behind her. The architecture of their ambush was fully built, but they had constructed it on a foundation of outdated information. The severance they were offering was meaningless. The real conflict was about to begin, and I held every single piece of leverage in the room. My father tapped his expensive pen against the thick stack of legal paper resting on the restaurant tablecloth. He expected me to read the dense paragraphs and feel an overwhelming sense of panic. He believed the complex legal jargon would confuse me into compliance. He did not realize I had spent the last 4 years drafting and analyzing these exact types of documents. I looked down at the waiver of interest and felt a strange wave of nostalgia wash over me. The stark black text and the structured clauses reminded me of the long nights I spent sitting under fluorescent lights at a downtown legal clinic. That job was the only way I could afford the university education he was currently claiming to support. You have to understand the rigid math of my childhood to understand why I did not flinch at the sight of that waiver. Growing up in the Perry household meant learning early on that you were nothing more than a line item on a spreadsheet. We lived in a spacious colonial home in a wealthy suburban neighborhood. From the outside, we presented a flawless picture of American success. Inside those walls, every ounce of parental affection was subjected to a strict cost-benefit analysis. I was not treated as a daughter. I was treated as an operating expense. My older brother Brandon was the biological golden child of the family. His existence was celebrated with an open checkbook and zero accountability. I vividly remember the morning of his 18th birthday. Richard walked him down our paved driveway and handed him the keys to a brand new silver sports utility vehicle. Brandon had wrecked a leased sedan only 3 months prior by driving through a concrete retaining wall near his high school. The response to his dangerous recklessness was an expensive vehicle upgrade. My parents simply absorbed his mistakes and categorized them as necessary investments in his future. He was their blood relative. He was the heir to their legacy, and his comfort was non-negotiable. My milestones were handled through a very different budget. I received clearance rack clothing that was always purchased one size too large, so I could grow into it over several years. If I needed a new graphing calculator for an advanced mathematics class, my mother would perform a heavy theatrical sigh right in the middle of the store aisle. She would hold the plastic packaging as if it weighed 50 pounds and deliver a stern lecture about the rising cost of household utilities. I learned very quickly how to shrink my physical needs. I taught myself how to sew patches into the knees of my denim jeans. I borrowed heavy science textbooks from the campus library instead of asking for the money to buy my own copies. Brenda taught me a brutal lesson without ever saying the actual words out loud. A quiet child is a cheap child. I stopped asking for anything by the time I reached 10 years old. I figured out that being entirely low maintenance was the only currency I possessed to buy their daily tolerance. If I did not cost them a single dollar, they would allow me to exist in the background, without directing their sharp frustration toward me. It was a calculated survival tactic. I became a ghost in my own bedroom, while Brandon threw loud weekend parties downstairs that required professional cleaning services the next morning. I did not realize I had been formally priced until I was old enough to read the ledger for myself. The illusion shattered permanently during the spring semester of my senior year in high school. The college acceptance letters started arriving in the mail. I earned a partial academic scholarship to a highly competitive university program. I proudly brought the acceptance letter to the kitchen table and placed it next to my father's morning coffee mug. Richard read the remaining tuition balance and immediately slid the paper back across the granite counter. He told me the household budget was currently focused on paying for out-of-state tuition and expensive fraternity dues for Brandon. Richard suggested I look into a local community college or take out a series of high-interest student loans. There was no college fund saved for me. There was no financial safety net. I refused to let their financial withholding dictate the trajectory of my life. I accepted the university offer and found a way to bridge the gap using my own labor. I secured a job working the overnight shift as a records clerk at a corporate law firm specializing in trusts and estates. I attended grueling accounting lectures during the day and spent my evenings organizing the financial lives of wealthy strangers. My shift started at 6 in the evening and ended at 2 in the morning. I drank terrible break room coffee to stay awake and learned the quiet language of wealth preservation. The law firm served as a masterclass in human behavior and financial deception. I spent hundreds of hours reading beneficiary designations and complex distribution schedules. I sorted through heavy archival boxes filled with notarized contracts. I saw how rich parents structured their physical assets to control their adult children from beyond the grave. I learned the distinct difference between a revocable trust and an irrevocable arrangement. I learned how people hid massive sums of money in plain sight using corporate trustees and anonymous shell accounts. My university classes taught me the theoretical principles of forensic accounting, but that overnight job taught me the ugly reality of how families weaponize their money. While I was working 50-hour weeks to cover my rent and tuition, my parents maintained the public illusion that they were generously funding my education. Brenda would post long updates on her social media accounts praising my academic success. She would hint at the great personal sacrifices they made to put 2 children through prestigious universities. I would read her glowing public posts while sitting on a cheap mattress in a studio apartment I paid for with my own wages. They were actively harvesting the social credit of my achievements without contributing a single cent to my survival. The deeper I dove into the mechanics of estate law, the more the math of my own childhood stopped making sense. My parents were comfortable, but their documented salaries were not high enough to sustain Brandon and his reckless spending without touching their principal savings. Yet their lifestyle never diminished. Richard bought an exclusive golf club membership. Brenda renovated our kitchen twice in a span of 5 years. The numbers did not align with the standard upper-middle-class income bracket. I knew how to read a balance sheet, and their balance sheet was defying gravity. Someone else was subsidizing their luxury. A forensic accountant operates on a very simple foundational principle. When the outward spending does not match the known income, you follow the paper trail backward until you locate the hidden source. I started applying the investigative tools I learned at the law firm to my own family history. I spent my designated break times looking up public property records and county tax assessments on the firm computers. I was looking for a minor discrepancy in their filing history. I thought I might find a hidden personal loan or an undisclosed second mortgage. I was not prepared for the elaborate financial structure I was about to unearth. The waiver. My father just slid across the restaurant table was not a surprise. It was the final piece of a puzzle I had already solved months ago. He pointed to the signature line with his pen, expecting me to surrender my rights in exchange for a quiet lunch. He had no idea that my exhausting overnight shifts had trained me to read the exact legal trap he was currently trying to spring. My eyes scanned the boilerplate text on the page, and I zeroed in on the specific entity they were asking me to release. The name of the estate listed on the document confirmed everything I found in the county archives. The conflict was no longer about childhood favoritism or neglected birthdays. The conflict was about a 20-year financial fraud, and the deadline for their payout was expiring today. I knew the waiver was coming long before my father ever unzipped his leather portfolio. The physical document resting on the restaurant table was simply the final symptom of a disease I diagnosed months earlier. The isolation protocol began exactly 6 months before my graduation day. It was not a sudden argument or a dramatic screaming match that fractured our relationship. It was a coordinated freeze executed with the silent precision of a corporate layoff. They simply stopped acknowledging my existence. My first clear indication of the freeze occurred in late November. I sent a standard text message to my mother asking what time I should arrive at the house for the annual Thanksgiving dinner. The message was marked as delivered. 2 days passed without a response. On the 3rd day, the digital read receipt appeared beneath my text. She had opened it and chose to ignore it. I followed up with a brief message to my father asking if the holiday schedule had changed. He never opened the message at all. I spent Thanksgiving alone in my cramped studio apartment, eating cheap takeout food while studying for my midterms. 1 week later, the visual evidence of my exclusion surfaced on social media. My brother Brandon uploaded a series of high-resolution photos to his profile. He was standing on a snow-covered mountain at an exclusive ski resort in Colorado. My parents were positioned right beside him. They were wearing brand new expensive winter gear and smiling brightly against the alpine backdrop. They had booked flights and arranged luxury lodging for a family vacation without mentioning a single word of it to me. I sat in my apartment and stared at the glowing screen of my phone. I scrutinized their smiling faces and registered the deliberate nature of my absence. In previous years, my mother always demanded my presence at family gatherings. She treated me like a necessary stage prop to maintain the suburban optics of a perfect household. She wanted her friends and neighbors to see that she successfully raised a daughter who was quietly achieving academic honors. She would position me in the background of holiday photographs to project an image of maternal accomplishment. The sudden decision to exclude me from a major holiday trip defied her usual pattern of behavior. My analytical training immediately flagged the discrepancy. Human beings, operating a long-term deception, do not suddenly change their behavioral patterns out of random malice. They change their patterns because an external variable forces their hand. People do not pull away so drastically unless a specific schedule dictates their departure. They were systematically excising me from the family unit, and my forensic accounting classes taught me exactly how to interpret that kind of abrupt detachment. When a liability outweighs a benefit, the entity will move to sever the connection before a deadline arrives. I realized my graduation date was their deadline. I decided to treat my own family history as a hostile audit. I took their silence as a directive to dig deeper into the financial architecture of our lives. I spent the dark winter months of my final semester running a silent investigation. My overnight job at the legal clinic provided me with unrestricted access to county property databases and public estate filings. While my classmates were attending college parties, I was sitting alone under buzzing fluorescent lights, tracking the paper trail of Richard and Brenda Perry. The first thread I pulled was the deed to our sprawling colonial home. I logged into the municipal tax assessment portal and searched my father's name. I expected to see his name listed as the primary property owner, alongside a standard mortgage lender. The search results returned a completely different reality. The house was not owned by Richard Perry. It was owned by a corporate holding entity managed by a wealth management firm based in Philadelphia. My father was legally classified as a mere tenant in the home he always claimed to own. I followed the holding entity through the state business registry. The corporate officers listed on the filing directed me to a specialized estate planning division of a major bank. The pieces began to lock together. My father did not possess the financial acumen to establish a complex corporate shield for a residential property. Someone else built that structure. I shifted my focus away from my parents and began searching the probate records for my paternal grandfather. Arthur Perry passed away when I was 12 years old. He was a ruthless pragmatist who built a regional logistics company from the ground up. He never respected my father. He always viewed Richard as a weak man with a dangerous inability to manage a budget. I requested the public filings related to Arthur Perry and paid the required processing fees using my own meager savings. I waited for the digital documents to clear the county clerk office. The silence from my parents continued throughout the spring semester. They did not call to ask about my final exams. They did not send a single text to check on my well-being. I lived in a state of suspended animation, waiting for the archival files to arrive while watching my parents pretend I was already dead. The psychological discipline required to endure that ghosting was immense. I channeled my hurt into my investigation. When the documents finally arrived in my secure inbox, I spent hours reading the dense legal formatting. I uncovered a network of fiduciary arrangements designed to protect the family assets from my father's inevitable incompetence. My grandfather had utilized a specialized family trust to bypass his son and secure the wealth for the next generation. I read the distribution schedules and the operational mandates governing the trust accounts. I finally understood the mechanism that subsidized their luxury vacations and paid for my brother's expensive vehicles. They were drawing on a finite resource, and that resource had an expiration date. The silent treatment stretched all the way into May. I was exactly 2 weeks away from walking across the university stage to receive my diploma when my phone rang. I was sitting at my desk reviewing a final project when the screen lit up. The caller identification displayed my mother's name. I let the phone ring 4 times before I pressed the green button to accept the call. I did not speak first. I waited for her to initiate the contact. Brenda's voice poured through the speaker with a manufactured sweetness that made my skin crawl. She used a high-pitched, honeyed tone she reserved for manipulating social situations. She called me sweetheart and asked how my final classes were finishing up. She spoke as if the last 6 months of total silence had never happened. She did not apologize for ignoring my messages or excluding me from the holidays. She simply erased the freeze and expected me to follow her lead. She said she and my father were so incredibly proud of my hard work and that they wanted to celebrate me properly. She then extended the invitation. She told me they booked a table at an exclusive restaurant near campus for the afternoon of my graduation. She described the menu and emphasized how difficult it was to secure a reservation. She framed the lunch as a grand maternal gesture. I sat at my desk and looked at the printed copies of my grandfather's trust documents scattered across my textbooks. I listened to her spin a web of counterfeit affection while the undeniable proof of her financial fraud rested right under my fingertips. I felt the invisible lock turning. Brenda Perry only became generous when a financial return was guaranteed. She would never pay for an expensive lunch unless the cost of the meal was a necessary business expense required to execute a larger transaction. The sudden invitation confirmed every single theory I had developed over the winter. They needed me in a controlled public environment to secure my signature. They needed to blindside me with legal paperwork on a day when my emotional defenses were supposed to be compromised by a false sense of celebration. I did not confront her on the phone. I did not demand to know why they went to Colorado without me, or why they ignored my existence for half a year. A premature confrontation would only give them time to adjust their strategy. I kept my voice perfectly level and matched her polite tone. I told her the restaurant sounded lovely and that I would be happy to meet them there after the ceremony. I accepted the invitation politely and hung up the phone. I knew exactly what was waiting for me at that table. I knew the exact reason they were rushing to cut ties with me on the very day my university career concluded. The trap was set, but they were the ones walking into it. The truth rested inside a 60-page distribution schedule filed by a corporate trustee in a downtown Philadelphia office. I opened the scanned document on my clinic terminal and began reading the dense paragraphs detailing the final wishes of Arthur Perry. My paternal grandfather died when I was in middle school. He was a self-made man who built a regional freight logistics company out of a single garage. He possessed calloused hands and a deep suspicion of unearned wealth. He also harbored a profound disappointment in his only son. Richard preferred the sanitized comfort of country club lounges over the grease and grit of the shipping yards. Arthur recognized that my father lacked the discipline required to maintain a financial legacy. When the logistics company was eventually liquidated, Arthur did not leave the resulting capital to Richard in a lump sum. He built a fortress around the money. The fortress was a generation-skipping family trust. I scrolled past the standard administrative clauses and found the specific directives regarding the care of his grandchildren. Arthur established a dedicated fund designed to ensure my educational and physical needs were met, regardless of my father's potential bankruptcies. The mechanism he chose was a caregiver distribution. The document explicitly authorized a generous monthly stipend payable to Richard and Brenda Perry. The funds were designated for the strict purpose of housing, feeding, and educating me. I read the dollar amount attached to that monthly distribution, and my vision blurred. The figure was staggering. It was more than enough to cover private school tuitions, pristine clothing, and a fully funded college savings account. The realization struck me with the force of a physical blow. My parents were never struggling to make ends meet. They were managing an active income stream. I was the underlying asset generating that revenue. The cost-benefit analysis of my childhood suddenly came into sharp focus. Every time Brenda sighed over the cost of my school supplies or forced me to wear oversized garments from clearance racks, she was not managing a tight household budget. She was widening her profit margin. They treated my upbringing like a corrupt municipal contract. By minimizing the overhead cost of my existence, they maximized the amount of trust money they could skim for their own lifestyle. The funds intended for my welfare were quietly diverted to pay for the kitchen renovations, the exclusive golf memberships, and Brandon's luxury vehicles. My quiet obedience and low-maintenance personality simply made their theft easier to execute. I was a cash crop they harvested in secret. I continued reading the document to understand why they were currently orchestrating a sudden disownment. The answer lived in Section 4 of the distribution schedule. Arthur Perry possessed enough foresight to know his son would exploit the arrangement if given a chance. He placed a hard expiration date on the caregiver stipend. The legal text stated that all monthly payments directed to Richard and Brenda Perry would terminate effective immediately upon my receipt of a bachelor's degree from an accredited university. On that exact date, their status as financial custodians would legally expire. The subsequent clause outlined the true danger facing my parents today. Upon the termination of the caregiver distributions, the entire remainder of the trust principal would bypass my parents and vest directly in my name. The corporate trustee in Philadelphia was legally obligated to transfer the remaining millions into accounts under my sole control. My parents were not just losing their monthly stipend, they were losing access to the core fortune they had been circling for 2 decades. The money was ending today. I leaned back in my cheap office chair and analyzed their legal strategy. The pieces fit together flawlessly. My parents knew the trust transfer was automatic. They knew the corporate bank would inevitably contact me to facilitate the handover of the assets. They needed a mechanism to intercept that transfer before I realized the remainder belonged to me. The expensive restaurant lunch and the sudden maternal warmth were staged to create a vulnerable environment. They planned to slide a broad waiver of interest across the table and demand my signature. If I signed that specific waiver without reading the fine print, I would surrender my standing as a beneficiary. They retained a discreet lawyer to draft a document that masqueraded as a standard estate separation, but functioned as a legal relinquishment of my grandfather's trust. Armed with my signature, they could petition the probate court to redirect the vesting remainder back into their own accounts. They were relying on my emotional devastation to blind me to the financial trap. They thought they held the leverage because they assumed I was a naive student craving their validation. I refused to walk into that restaurant unrepresented. I printed a physical copy of the distribution schedule and scheduled a morning consultation with an independent estate attorney. I bypassed the senior partners at my own clinic to ensure strict confidentiality. I found a sharp litigator located 3 towns over and paid her hourly retainer using the wages I saved from my overnight shifts. I sat in her polished office and handed her the printed pages. I explained my theory and watched her eyes scan the text. She confirmed every single detail. The attorney verified that the caregiver distributions were legitimate, ongoing, and scheduled to terminate on the day of my graduation. She explained that the waiver my parents intended to present was a desperate maneuver lacking true legal authority unless I willingly signed it. She offered to draft a formal cease and desist letter or notify the corporate trustee of their impending fraud. She wanted to intervene and shut down their scheme before the graduation lunch ever took place. I declined her offer. I instructed her to draft a simple letter of representation confirming that I had retained independent counsel. I wanted the element of surprise. I had spent my entire life being manipulated in the dark, and I intended to finish this negotiation in the light. I placed the retainer letter and the trust schedule into a plain manila folder. I possessed the documentation required to destroy their financial ambush. Yet the trust document contained one additional detail that unsettled me. While analyzing the legal definitions in the opening pages, I noticed a discrepancy in how Arthur Perry classified his heirs. The estate lawyers who drafted the original text utilized precise language to define the beneficiaries. Brandon was repeatedly identified as the biological grandson. My name was followed by a very different legal classification. The document referred to me as the legally adopted granddaughter. The words sat on the page like a dormant virus. I read the sentence multiple times trying to comprehend the implication. My parents never disclosed an adoption. They wove a cohesive narrative regarding my birth and seamlessly integrated it into our family history. The discovery that I was not biologically related to them shifted the entire foundation of their abuse. They did not just favor their biological son over their biological daughter. They acquired an outside child to act as a funding mechanism. This new revelation demanded a different kind of investigation. Forensic accounting could track the stolen money, but it could not tell me where I actually came from. I needed to know the origin of my placement in their home. The financial betrayal was a profound violation, but the theft of my identity introduced a new layer of psychological warfare. I decided to submit my information to the state adoption registry. I needed to find out who gave me away before my parents tried to throw me away. That decision triggered the arrival of a second envelope and the introduction of a family I never knew existed. The revelation of my adoption, hidden deep within my grandfather's trust schedule, fundamentally altered the trajectory of my investigation. Forensic accounting relies on tracing a visible origin point, but I suddenly lacked a true point of origin. The people I called my parents were legally assigned custodians executing a long-term contract. My biological identity was a blank space on a ledger. I needed to fill that space. During my sophomore year of college, I submitted a genetic sample to the State Adoption Reunion Registry. It was an impulsive decision prompted by a campus biology seminar regarding hereditary traits. I filled out the required administrative forms, mailed the kit, and promptly buried the memory under a mountain of coursework. The registry functioned as a passive database requiring a mutual match to trigger an alert. My profile sat dormant in their servers for 2 years. The second envelope arrived exactly 7 days after I read the trust distribution schedule. I found it resting in my narrow metal mailbox at the apartment complex. The return address featured the official seal of the State Health Department. The timing felt almost orchestrated by an unseen hand. The financial truth surfaced, and the biological truth followed right behind it. I carried the envelope up 3 flights of stairs and placed it on my laminate kitchen counter. I stared at the sealed flap for a long time. Opening legal documents at the law firm felt routine because the outcomes affected wealthy strangers. Opening this particular envelope required a different type of courage. I retrieved a small knife and sliced the paper open. Inside the official casing rested a handwritten letter on plain white stationery. The handwriting was careful and looping. It belonged to a woman named Clara Bennett. She did not use a rigid legal format or a guarded tone. She wrote with a vulnerable honesty that immediately disarmed my analytical defenses. Clara explained that she was 19 years old when she placed me for adoption. She detailed the circumstances of her decision without asking for pity. She lacked the financial stability to raise a child and believed the agency would place me in a home equipped to provide a secure future. She thought she was sacrificing her own happiness to guarantee my success. She had no way of knowing this agency handed me over to a couple who viewed me as a subsidized asset. Clara stated she lived in a small suburb just outside the Philadelphia city limits. She offered to meet me in person or speak on the phone. She explicitly outlined her boundaries to protect my peace of mind. She wrote that she harbored no expectations regarding a relationship. She did not want money or a sudden role in my daily life. She simply wanted to know if I was safe and healthy. At the very bottom of the page, right beneath her signature, she added one final sentence. The ink was slightly darker, as if she pressed the pen harder into the paper. She wrote that she never stopped saving a seat for me. I read that final sentence until the words blurred together. My entire survival strategy was built on the premise of utility. I only earned a seat at the Perry dining table if I remained quiet and cost nothing. I maintained my friendships at the university by always paying the dinner tab and offering free tutoring for accounting exams. I dated briefly during my junior year, but I ended the relationship the moment my partner asked me to trust him with a personal vulnerability. I treated human connection like a volatile stock market. I only invested my time when I could clearly calculate the return, and I always kept an exit strategy prepared. I drafted flawless financial boundaries for legal clients every single night. I knew how to protect assets. I had no idea how to let another human being want me just for existing. The concept of being wanted without a transaction attached to the dynamic paralyzed me. Clara Bennett did not require a caregiver distribution to think about me. She did not need a trust fund remainder to save a seat for me over the span of 2 decades. Her desire to meet me contained no hidden invoice. That realization terrified me far more than Brenda and her calculated cruelty ever could. Brenda was a known variable. I could anticipate her manipulation and outmaneuver her financial traps because greed operates on a predictable algorithm. Unconditional affection possessed no algorithm. It required a surrender of control. My initial instinct was to run a comprehensive background check on Clara Bennett. I wanted to use my clinic access to pull her credit history and verify her employment status. I wanted to find the hidden catch before it could ensnare me. I turned on my laptop and typed her name into the public records database. My finger hovered over the enter key for a full minute. I looked at the handwritten letter resting next to my keyboard. If I treated Clara like a hostile suspect, I would be operating using the exact same emotional deficit that defined my adoptive parents. I would be reducing a vulnerable woman to a set of data points. I closed the laptop screen. I decided to leave the forensic accounting tools out of this equation. I purchased a simple card from a local pharmacy and sat at my kitchen counter to draft a reply. Writing a few sentences proved to be the most difficult assignment of my academic career. I drafted and discarded 5 different versions before I found the correct tone. I kept my response brief and factual. I thanked her for reaching out and confirmed that I was healthy and about to graduate from college. I agreed to a brief introductory meeting. I selected a neutral public location halfway between my university campus and her Philadelphia suburb. I dropped the envelope in a postal collection box the following morning and felt a sudden knot form in my stomach. The days leading up to the meeting forced me to navigate 2 parallel realities. In one reality, I was preparing to face a mother who viewed me as a depreciating asset. I was gathering legal documents to defend myself against a financial ambush on my graduation day. In the other reality, I was preparing to look into the eyes of a woman who gave me away, hoping to secure my future. I was bracing myself for a confrontation built on fraud, while simultaneously walking toward a reunion built on hope. The emotional whiplash left me exhausted. I could analyze numbers for 40 hours a week without fatigue, but anticipating this diner meeting drained my reserves. The morning of the scheduled meeting arrived with heavy gray clouds and a steady drizzle. I borrowed a reliable sedan from a trusted classmate and drove east toward the designated diner. I gripped the steering wheel and practiced my breathing exercises. I wore a plain gray sweater and dark slacks. I wanted to look professional and guarded. I treated the drive like a commute to a tense legal deposition. I cataloged the potential outcomes in my mind. Clara might be unstable. She might be disappointed by the guarded young woman she was about to meet. She might realize the fantasy of her lost daughter was better than the damaged reality sitting across from her in a vinyl booth. I parked the car in the cracked asphalt lot of the diner. The neon sign above the entrance flickered against the overcast sky. I sat in the driver's seat and watched the front door. A small bell chimed every time a customer entered or exited the building. I checked my reflection in the rearview mirror and smoothed my hair. I did not possess a legal waiver to protect me in this scenario. I did not have a manila folder filled with financial leverage to slide across the table if the conversation turned hostile. I was stepping into a room armed with nothing but my own fragile identity. I gathered my purse and opened the car door. The bell chimed as I walked into the diner and scanned the booths. A woman sitting alone in the back corner raised her head. The resemblance hit me like a physical force. The true test of my survival was not defending my fortune against the people who bought me. The true test was figuring out how to sit across from the woman who gave me away. The bell chiming behind me signaled my arrival. I walked past the front counter and approached the back booth. The woman sitting there lifted her head. Clara Bennett possessed the exact same jawline I saw in the mirror every single morning. It was an incredibly jarring experience to look across a cracked vinyl table and see my own biological features staring back at me. She wore a simple navy cardigan and kept her hands tightly wrapped around a ceramic coffee mug. Beside her cup rested a thick leather photo album. I watched her fingertips graze the edge of the heavy cover. She was visibly terrified of moving too quickly and scaring me away. I slid into the booth opposite her, and we sat in complete silence for a long time. We shared an identical habit of shutting down verbally when the emotional temperature of a room spiked. The waitress approached and poured my coffee without interrupting our quiet standoff. I realized Clara was respectfully waiting for my permission to cross the boundary. I offered a slight nod and she finally took a deep breath. Clara did not launch into a dramatic theatrical apology. She spoke softly and measured her sentences carefully. She explained the harsh reality of her life at 19 years old. She worked 2 minimum wage jobs and slept on a sagging couch in a crowded apartment. She placed me for adoption because she wanted me to have a stable foundation she simply could not provide. She believed the agency would select a family that would cherish my presence. She had no idea they selected a couple who viewed a child as a lucrative tax advantage and a trust fund prerequisite. I listened to her story and felt the tension slowly leave my shoulders. She did not ask me for forgiveness. She asked about my college major. I explained the mechanics of forensic accounting, and she listened with genuine fascination. She did not pretend to grasp the intricate corporate tax loopholes I described. She simply enjoyed hearing my voice. Halfway through our meal, Clara finally opened the leather album. It did not contain photographs of my childhood because she missed those years. It contained pictures of the maternal family I never knew existed. She turned the thick pages and pointed to a faded photograph of an older woman standing on a concrete porch. This was my birth grandmother, Beatrice. Clara described Beatrice as a diminutive woman standing barely 5 feet tall, but armed with a fiercely protective spirit. Beatrice managed a public middle school cafeteria for 3 decades. She memorized the names of hundreds of passing children and made sure the underprivileged students always received extra portions. Clara told me Beatrice was waiting at home right now, praying that this diner meeting went well. That initial meeting sparked a deliberate 6-month process of building a relationship from scratch. I approached our emerging connection the same way I approached a corporate audit. I treated their kindness as an unverified asset and constantly searched for the hidden liabilities. The Perry household conditioned me to anticipate an invoice for every display of affection. I fully expected Clara to eventually ask for a personal loan or demand a significant favor I could not comfortably refuse. Those demands never materialized. Clara and Beatrice only called my phone to ask about my rigorous exam schedule or to check if I was eating properly during finals week. They memorized the dates of my most difficult presentations and sent simple text messages wishing me luck. This unconditional attention felt highly suspicious to a mind trained to expose financial fraud. I decided to stress test their loyalty using the only defensive tactics I knew. I began canceling our weekend lunch plans at the very last minute. I manufactured weak excuses about overwhelming study loads or sudden fatigue. I sat in my apartment and braced myself for the inevitable freeze. I waited for the passive-aggressive silence and the sharp withdrawal of approval that always followed any minor failure in my adoptive home. The punishment never arrived. When I abruptly canceled a Sunday afternoon coffee, Clara simply replied that she understood completely and urged me to focus on my academic success. She did not weaponize her disappointment. She did not withhold her communication the following week. The total absence of retaliation caused a profound structural shift in my psychological armor. I was waiting for a trap that did not exist. The breaking point of my cynicism occurred in late April, during a dinner at a small independent Italian restaurant located in downtown Philadelphia. It was the first time I sat down to share a meal with both Clara and Beatrice together. Beatrice matched her description perfectly. She was tiny, but possessed a sharp, calculating gaze that missed absolutely nothing. When the waiter brought the final bill to the table, I immediately reached into my leather purse and extracted my debit card. I aggressively insisted on covering the entire cost of the dinner. I was operating on pure instinct. I was desperate to prove my financial utility to these women. I needed to demonstrate that my presence was not a burden on their modest budgets. Beatrice reached across the red checkered tablecloth and placed her weathered hand firmly over mine. Her physical grip possessed a surprising amount of strength. She pushed my plastic card back toward my purse and locked her eyes onto mine. She spoke with an authority that commanded absolute obedience. She told me I did not have to buy my way into their lives. She stated that my seat at their table was already paid for. That single sentence dismantled 22 years of conditioned anxiety. The heavy knot I carried in my chest since I was a little girl, quietly patching her own clothes, finally began to loosen. I sat in that Italian restaurant and allowed myself to simply exist without proving my worth on a balance sheet. But the profound comfort of my new reality served to highlight the toxic danger of my old one. As the month of May approached, the calendar ticked dangerously close to my graduation day. The corporate trust deadline was rapidly approaching. I knew Brenda and Richard were preparing their final maneuver. They were gathering their fraudulent legal waivers and selecting an expensive restaurant to stage their ambush. I realized I could not face their calculated cruelty alone. I no longer wanted to endure their abuse in silence. I needed my real family to watch me sever the artificial ties. The two drastically different worlds of my existence were hurtling toward a direct collision, and I decided to orchestrate the crash myself. The moment I ended the phone call with Brenda, my apartment felt entirely different. The manufactured sweetness of her voice lingered in the quiet room like a foul odor. She issued the invitation to the graduation lunch, using the tone of a generous matriarch, but I knew she was merely scheduling a hostile takeover. I placed my mobile phone on the kitchen counter and looked at the printed trust documents stacked near my laptop. I had a choice to make. I could attend the lunch and endure their rehearsed cruelty in silence, just as I had done for 2 decades. I could refuse the invitation and force them to mail the fraudulent legal waiver to my address. Or I could take control of the narrative and turn their financial ambush into a public audit. My forensic accounting professors always taught us that uncovering fraud is only the first step of an investigation. The second step is trapping the fraudster in a controlled environment where they cannot escape the evidence. I decided to build a trap. I picked up my phone and initiated the first phase of my strategy. I dialed the Philadelphia area code and waited while the line connected. Clara answered on the second ring with a genuine warmth that contrasted sharply against my adoptive mother's previous call. I did not engage in small talk. I knew I had to explain a complex legal situation without sounding frantic or unstable. I laid out the mechanics of my grandfather's trust and the strict expiration date attached to my university degree. I detailed the waiver my father commissioned to steal the remainder of the estate. I felt a momentary spike of anxiety sharing these financial realities. My corporate legal training conditioned me to keep asset intelligence strictly compartmentalized. I worried Clara might view the hidden trust money as a sudden incentive to stay in my life. Trust requires transparency, and I was asking her to step into a volatile environment. I gave her the unvarnished ledger of my life. Clara listened to my entire explanation without interrupting a single time. She did not ask about the specific dollar amount hidden inside the trust remainder. She did not express theatrical outrage or promise to fight my adoptive parents in the middle of a restaurant. She only asked how the impending betrayal made me feel. I told her I was tired of being a financial prop in a suburban theater. I explained that I intended to attend the lunch and let them play their hand. I asked if she and Beatrice would drive down to attend my graduation ceremony and sit at a nearby table during the meal afterward. I needed a grounding presence in the room. I needed witnesses who cared about my well-being rather than my utility. Clara delivered a response that stripped away the last of my lingering doubts. She said they would be honored to watch me not need my adoptive parents anymore. The tactical phase began immediately after we finalized the timing. I found the phone number for the high-end dining establishment Brenda selected for her ambush. I called the host stand and utilized a crisp, professional voice. I stated I was an executive assistant finalizing a graduation lunch for the Perry family. I confirmed my father's reservation for a corner booth in the back of the dining room. Richard always preferred corner booths because they allowed him to control the acoustics of his intimidation tactics while monitoring the surrounding space. Once the host verified his booking, I requested a secondary reservation under my own name. I explicitly asked for the table directly adjacent to the Perry booth. I explained it was for a separate party that needed to remain close to the main group. The host reviewed the seating chart and assigned table 4. I thanked the staff member and ended the call. The geometry of the confrontation was formally set. The morning of graduation arrived with clear skies and unseasonable humidity. I wore the traditional black gown and a stiff mortarboard cap. I sat in a row containing hundreds of students waiting for our names to be called. The stadium was a sea of folding chairs and nervous energy. I turned my head and scanned the crowded bleachers. I located Richard and Brenda sitting near a concrete aisle. Richard was scrolling through his mobile phone and ignoring the opening speeches. Brenda was inspecting her manicure and occasionally adjusting her designer sunglasses. They looked like bored investors waiting for a tedious quarterly meeting to conclude. They were not there to celebrate a milestone. They were simply running out the clock until the real business transaction could begin. I shifted my gaze to a higher seating tier on the opposite side of the stadium. Clara and Beatrice were sitting close together. Beatrice wore a bright floral dress and held a printed program in her lap. Clara was holding a small camera and leaning forward against the metal railing. They were focused entirely on the stage. The contrast between the two sets of spectators was striking. The people who raised me were tracking a deadline. The people who gave me away were witnessing a daughter. When my name finally echoed through the stadium speakers, I stood up and walked across the wooden platform. I shook hands with the university dean and accepted the padded diploma folder. The folder was physically empty because the registrar mails the actual certificate weeks later, but the symbolism finalized the trust condition. The moment my hand touched that leather binder, the caregiver distributions officially terminated. The legal authority shifted. The money belonged to me. I walked down the wooden ramp knowing my adoptive parents were now funding their own lives. They were drawing on empty accounts and they did not even know it yet. We navigated the crowded campus lawns after the closing ceremony concluded. Brenda found me near a designated photo area. She offered a stiff, rigid hug for a passing campus photographer and immediately dropped her arms the moment the camera flash faded. Richard checked his watch and noted our upcoming reservation time. He told me to drive my own vehicle and meet them at the restaurant. They walked away toward their luxury sedan without offering a single word of congratulations. Their efficiency confirmed everything I needed to know. The pleasantries were over. I walked to my borrowed car and mentally rehearsed my lines. I treated the drive like a commute to a hostile deposition. I focused on my breathing and reviewed the documents resting inside my manila folder. I parked in the back lot of the restaurant and turned off the ignition. I knew Clara and Beatrice were already inside because we coordinated their arrival time to happen 15 minutes prior to ours. I wanted them seated and settled before Brenda and Richard ever walked into the room. I grabbed my purse and walked through the heavy mahogany doors. The interior of the restaurant was cool and smelled of roasted garlic and expensive wine. I checked my posture and approached the host stand. The staff member guided me through the dining room toward the back corner. I saw my parents sitting in the booth. I saw Clara and Beatrice sitting quietly at table 4 directly behind my mother's chair. I slid into the booth across from the people who bought me. I set my bag on the floor. Richard unzipped his dark leather portfolio and the sound of the metal teeth separating signaled the beginning of the end. The sound of the metal teeth separating on Richard's portfolio hung in the air above our table. He withdrew a thick stack of ivory paper bound by a single brass staple in the top corner. He squared the edges against the polished wood of the booth, with the practiced efficiency of a manager preparing to terminate an employee. The restaurant hummed around us with the ambient noise of clinking silver and low conversations. Richard placed his hands flat on either side of the document and pushed it across the white tablecloth. The paper slid to a halt inches from my water glass. He adjusted his tie and cleared his throat. He did not look me in the eye. He focused his gaze on a point somewhere near my collarbone. He stated that we needed to conduct a realistic assessment of our future relationship. He spoke using the exact cadence he employed when negotiating contractor disputes for his suburban renovations. He announced that he and Brenda had already filed the necessary legal paperwork to formalize a permanent separation of our lives. He claimed they wanted to handle this transition cleanly, so there would be no confusion moving forward. He used the word transition to describe the act of abandoning his daughter on her graduation day. I looked down at the ivory paper resting near my hands. I did not touch it. I simply let my eyes scan the opening lines visible on the top page. The caption featured the bold block lettering of a discount legal firm located in a strip mall near their neighborhood. I recognized the font and the boilerplate formatting instantly. During my overnight shifts at the downtown clinic, my supervising attorney would often use these exact types of cheap generic templates as examples of lazy lawyering. The document was officially titled as a voluntary waiver of interest and release of future claims. Richard continued his rehearsed monologue while I evaluated his legal weapon. He explained that my graduation signified the end of their legal and moral obligations to support me. He said they were cutting me out of their personal estate to ensure their hard-earned wealth remained secure. He spoke about self-reliance and the importance of making my own way in the world. He framed the disownment as a character-building exercise designed to push me toward independence. The hypocrisy of a man subsidizing his country club fees with my trust fund, lecturing me about self-reliance, was almost poetic. I kept my hands folded in my lap and studied the legal trap he laid in front of me. The document contained standard relinquishment clauses designed to trick an uninformed party into surrendering their rights. It required my signature to certify that I willfully waived any claim to the assets held by the Perry family estate. The strategy was clear and deeply flawed. They wanted me to sign away my legal standing while I was blinded by the emotional shock of being disowned. They were relying on my presumed ignorance to secure their financial future. My analytical mind immediately dismantled their approach. The fatal error in their strategy was written right there in the identifying caption. They aimed their expensive legal maneuver directly at their own personal will. The document explicitly protected the private assets belonging to Richard and Brenda Perry. It protected their checking accounts and their modest retirement portfolios. It offered absolute protection for a fraction of the actual wealth. They failed to mention the corporate trustee in Philadelphia. They omitted any reference to Arthur Perry or the generation-skipping trust that actually funded their luxurious existence. A basic rule of estate law dictates that a beneficiary cannot forfeit a corporate trust by signing a generic waiver directed at a separate personal will. My parents hired a budget attorney to draft a threatening document without disclosing the existence of the grandfather trust to their own legal counsel. They were attempting to execute a shadow transaction. They thought they were being incredibly clever by keeping the multi-million-dollar remainder off the official record. In their desperate attempt to maintain secrecy, they outsmarted themselves. Their discount waiver was legally useless against the Philadelphia bank holding my inheritance. I let the silence stretch across the table. I absorbed the reality that the people who raised me were currently trying to defraud me. Richard leaned back against the leather booth and crossed his arms. He projected an aura of supreme confidence. He assumed the heavy legal jargon terrified me. He thought the thick stack of paper proved his unassailable authority. I looked at his smug posture and felt a profound sense of relief. The anxiety that haunted my childhood evaporated in that exact moment. The terrifying patriarch who controlled my access to food and shelter was just an arrogant man armed with an expired contract and a worthless piece of paper. Behind my mother's chair, I could hear the faint sound of silverware clinking against china at table 4. Clara and Beatrice were sitting there bearing silent witness to this theater. Their proximity provided an invisible anchor. I did not need to turn my head to know they were watching. I could feel their steady presence bridging the physical distance between our tables. Richard and Brenda had no idea that my biological family was currently analyzing their posture and documenting their cruelty. My adoptive parents believed they were executing a private execution in a public space. They were actually the unknowing subjects of a comprehensive audit. Richard unclipped an expensive fountain pen from his breast pocket and set it gently on top of the waiver. The metallic click of the pen hitting the table served as a prompt. He instructed me to review the bottom paragraph and sign my name on the designated line. He promised that once the signature was secured, we could enjoy a civilized meal and part ways as adults. He offered a civilized lunch as the grand prize for surrendering my birthright. He presented the transaction as if he were doing me a tremendous favor by buying me a plate of roasted chicken in exchange for my inheritance. I slowly reached my hand forward and traced the edge of the ivory paper with my index finger. I did not pick up the pen. I kept my breathing slow and measured. I knew that signing the document would not legally harm my claim to the trust, but I refused to give them the satisfaction of a signature. I wanted to see how far they would push the deception. I wanted to watch them deploy every single tactic they spent 6 months designing. My lack of immediate compliance unsettled Richard. He expected me to cry or beg for an explanation. My silent observation disrupted his timeline. He glanced sideways at Brenda. He offered her a subtle nod indicating that his corporate intimidation tactics were stalling. He was tagging her into the arena. Richard handled the paperwork, but Brenda always handled the psychological warfare. She was the architect of the emotional manipulation in our household. Brenda shifted her weight and leaned closer to the center of the table. She adjusted the silver wrapping paper on the small box she had placed there earlier. The ambient noise of the restaurant seemed to fade into the background as she prepared to speak. Her face softened into a counterfeit mask of maternal concern. I watched her eyes lock onto mine. The financial disownment was merely the opening salvo of their attack. Richard tried to take my money. Brenda was preparing to take my identity. She folded her hands over the white cloth and drew a deliberate breath. The real devastation of this lunch was about to be delivered. Brenda leaned across the table and placed her manicured hands on the white linen cloth. She possessed a very specific posture when she was about to dissect a vulnerable target. It was the same posture she used to dismantle a clumsy waitress or a neighborhood rival. Her spine straightened against the leather booth and her chin tilted downward just a fraction of an inch. She peered at me through her dark eyelashes. It was a predatory stance disguised as elegant maternal concern. She pushed the silver-wrapped box 1 inch closer to my dinner plate. The metallic paper caught the ambient light from the overhead chandelier. She instructed me to go ahead and open my graduation gift. Her voice was smooth and perfectly modulated to ensure the surrounding diners could not intercept her words. I knew the box was a dangerous distraction. It was a theatrical prop designed to elevate my expectations right before she cut the ground out from under my feet. I kept my hands firmly anchored in my lap. I told her I preferred to hear what she had to say before I accepted any presents. A flicker of annoyance crossed her pristine features. She despised it when a subject refused to follow her meticulously crafted script. She tapped her polished nail against the cardboard edge and released a heavy sigh. The sigh was a calculated warning meant to signal that I was being ungrateful and testing her patience. She decided to bypass the prop and proceed directly to the execution phase of her lunch. My mother folded her hands and leaned forward to deliver the line she had been practicing. She announced that she and Richard had to make some very difficult choices 22 years ago. She paused to let the gravity of the introduction settle over the table. Then she dropped the anvil. She announced that I was adopted and that they were never my biological parents. She stopped talking and watched my face closely while waiting for the emotional collapse. Her eyes tracked every minor muscle movement near my jaw and my brow. She was hunting for the devastation. She anticipated a sudden gasp or an immediate rush of tears. In her mind, this revelation was the ultimate trump card. She believed she was stripping away my entire identity in a single breath. She wanted me to break into pieces so she could sweep them up and walk away with a clear conscience. She could tell herself she had to be cruel to be kind. She could justify the abandonment by painting me as an unstable young woman who could not handle the truth of her own origins. I did not give her a single tear. I did not alter the rhythm of my breathing. I looked at her with the detached curiosity of a scientist observing a predictable chemical reaction. I already knew the truth about my adoption. Clara and Beatrice were sitting just a few feet behind her chair. My biological reality was not a traumatic void anymore. It was a living, breathing anchor seated right in the same room. My stoicism derailed her momentum. Brenda expected chaos and received absolute stillness. She realized the adoption reveal did not inflict the fatal wound she required to extract my signature on the legal waiver. She needed a deeper cut. She needed to ensure I felt entirely worthless before she pointed to the dotted signature line. Then she smiled and delivered the sentence I will remember for the rest of my life. It was not a warm expression. It was a razor-thin curving of the lips that did not reach her eyes. It was a smile born of pure spite and strategic advantage. She leaned closer and lowered her voice to a lethal whisper. She said they only kept me around for the benefits. She enunciated the word benefits as if it were a filthy secret meant to shame me. She explained that the monthly stipends were the only reason I was given a bedroom in their large house. She claimed the funding was the sole justification for my presence in their pristine family portraits. Then she finished her thought. She said I was completely useless to them now. Useless. The word hung in the quiet space between us. She equated my existence to a broken household appliance or an expired warranty. I was a tool that had served its function and was now ready for the scrap heap. She expected that word to destroy me. Instead, it acted as a skeleton key that unlocked the heavy chains I had dragged around for 2 decades. The smile was the detail that completely freed me. A mother does not smile while delivering life-altering news unless she enjoys the choreography of the pain. If she had cried or shown genuine remorse while disowning me, I might have experienced a lingering sense of guilt. I might have spent the next 10 years wondering if I could have done something differently to earn her love. I might have questioned my own inherent value. The venom in her smile eradicated every ounce of self-doubt I carried. The cruelty was not a sudden emotional outburst. It was a calculated business decision they had finally decided to execute. I realized my failure to secure her affection was never a reflection of my character. It was merely a reflection of their balance sheet. You cannot earn love from a person who only recognizes currency. A brief memory surfaced in my mind. I was 12 years old, standing in the kitchen while Brenda prepared for a charity gala. She spent 3 hours getting her hair professionally styled. I walked into the room holding a painting I made in my middle school art class. I was proud of the vibrant colors, and I wanted to show it to her. She looked at me with cold indifference and told me to get out of her sight before I ruined her dress. 10 minutes later, we arrived at the gala and she wrapped her arm around my shoulder in front of the local news cameras. She kissed my forehead and called me her greatest blessing. I spent years trying to reconcile the woman in the kitchen with the woman in front of the cameras. Sitting in the restaurant booth, I finally understood the dynamic. The cameras offered a social return on investment she could deposit into her ego. The quiet kitchen offered zero profit. I was only valuable when I was generating capital. Brenda sat back and waited for the devastation to wash over me. She had played her final card. She exposed the transactional nature of my childhood and informed me my account was officially overdrawn. She nudged the silver box forward one more time. She suggested I open it as a parting gift. She framed it as a token of goodwill to soften the blow of my termination. I kept my gaze fixed on her face. I did not look at the box or the legal waiver. I analyzed her breathing and the slight tension in her shoulders. She was waiting for the emotional surrender that would lead directly to my signature on Richard's document. I decided to oblige her request regarding the silver box. I reached out and pulled the small square package across the white cloth. The paper was perfectly folded and secured with an expensive silk ribbon. I untied the ribbon and let it fall to the table. I lifted the lid. The box was empty. There was no graduation gift. There was no token of goodwill. The empty box was a psychological tactic designed to reinforce my lack of value. It was a physical representation of her message. She wanted me to peer into a void and realize I was walking away with nothing. She wanted me to feel the hollow echo of my own worthlessness before I signed away my future. I looked down into the empty cardboard square and felt a genuine smile form on my own lips. My smile was not thin or spiteful. It was a smile born of authentic amusement. Brenda had spent weeks planning this intricate psychological torture chamber. She selected the expensive venue and hired the budget lawyer. She crafted the cruel dialogue and prepared the empty box. She built an entire theater of pain just to secure a signature on a worthless piece of paper. My reaction sent a shockwave across the table. Richard sat up straight and frowned. Brenda lost the smug curvature of her lips. Her eyes narrowed in confusion. She expected grief and anger. She did not know how to process my quiet amusement. Her script did not contain a contingency plan for a subject who refused to break under pressure. The air in the corner booth grew dense with sudden uncertainty. The predators were abruptly unsure of their prey. I placed the lid back on the empty silver box and pushed it gently toward the center of the table. The time for their presentation was officially over. I reached down to my side and placed my hand on the smooth exterior of my manila folder. I was ready to introduce my own evidence into the record. I reached for my water glass and wrapped my fingers around the chilled surface. The ice shifted slightly against the crystal, sending a faint vibration through my palm. I lifted the heavy glass and brought it to my lips, taking a slow, deliberate sip. I watched my own hand during the motion. My fingers did not tremble. My wrist did not shake. My hand was perfectly steady, and I filed that minor victory away in my mind as a crucial data point. 10 years ago, a single sharp glare from Brenda would send my nervous system into a frantic downward spiral. I used to drop dinner plates and stutter whenever she corrected my posture or criticized my academic efforts. I lived in a state of perpetual hypervigilance, always bracing for the next arbitrary punishment. Now I sat under the full weight of her engineered cruelty, and my pulse remained as calm as a dormant engine. I did not cry. I did not raise my voice to argue. I watched the bitter disappointment wash over my mother's face. She realized her meticulous script had failed. She anticipated a sobbing girl begging for a place in the family hierarchy. She wanted me to plead for scraps of affection and promise to be better just to keep my seat at their table. When I offered her a genuine smile of amusement instead of a tear, her entire demeanor fractured in real time. The polished facade of the suburban matriarch began to crack under the heavy pressure of my silence. Her jaw clenched tight enough to make the muscles flutter beneath her skin. She blinked rapidly, trying to recalculate the variables of our interaction. Brenda operated her entire life on the assumption that she could manipulate any outcome through sheer social intimidation. She grew up in a modest neighborhood and spent her adult years carefully erasing her working-class origins. She married Richard for his proximity to the Perry family wealth and spent decades cultivating a flawless country club persona. Her social standing was built on maintaining the illusion of absolute dominance. If she hosted a dinner party, the guests ate what she dictated. If she decorated a room, every piece of furniture adhered to her exact vision. She viewed me the same way she viewed her expensive dining room chairs. I was an object purchased to fulfill a specific aesthetic function. When an object defies its designated purpose, she does not know how to adapt. She lacks the emotional vocabulary to process genuine human defiance. The silence in our corner booth stretched into a tangible weight, pressing down on the white tablecloth. Richard shifted uncomfortably against the leather seating. He glanced at the discount legal waiver resting near my plate, and then looked back at his wife. Richard was a man who lived his entire life deferring to momentum. He allowed his late father to build the family fortune. He allowed the corporate trustee to dictate his monthly income. He allowed Brenda to run the household and enforce the psychological discipline. He was a passive passenger in his own existence. He expected his wife to close this deal. He relied on her to inflict the emotional damage required to secure my signature. But Brenda was floundering and Richard possessed no backup plan. I let the quiet drag on and observed their mounting panic. My forensic accounting professor taught me that silence is the most effective interrogation tool ever invented. In any tense negotiation, the person who rushes to fill the empty space is the person conceding power. Fraudsters hate silence because quiet rooms allow the victims to think. Criminals rely on noise and urgency to force a bad decision. They want to rush the paperwork and create a sense of impending doom. I had no intention of conceding a single inch to their urgency. I sat back against the booth and breathed in the scent of roasted garlic and expensive wine drifting from the restaurant kitchen. I made them sit in the awkward ruin of their failed ambush. The atmosphere in the restaurant felt entirely detached from the warfare occurring in our booth. Waiters in crisp white shirts glided past carrying trays of expensive appetizers. The soft jazz music playing over the hidden speakers provided an absurd soundtrack to my emancipation. I realized this was how white-collar crime always looked in practice. It did not involve dark alleys or dramatic physical altercations. It involved tailored suits and polite smiles in beautiful rooms. It involved signatures and handshakes and quiet conversations over expensive sparkling water. I felt a surge of professional pride. I was applying the exact skills I learned in dusty legal archives to save my own life. I was conducting a forensic takedown of the people who assumed I was too weak to read the fine print. The prolonged quiet finally broke her discipline. Brenda leaned forward again, but her posture lacked its previous elegance. Her movements were jerky and uncoordinated. She asked if I was going to say anything at all. Her voice took on a brittle edge. The honeyed tone she used on the phone to invite me to this lunch was gone. The cold whisper she used to deliver the disownment was also gone. What remained was the raw, grating sound of a woman losing her grip on a narrative she spent 6 months carefully designing. She demanded a reaction. She needed me to lash out or hurl an insult across the table so she could reclaim the moral high ground and play the victim. I considered the weight of the last 2 decades. I thought about the clearance rack sweaters and the sweating glasses of cheap store-brand juice. I drank while my brother received catered birthday meals and imported treats. I thought about the thousands of hours I spent trying to decipher the unwritten rules of their household. I constantly adjusted my personality to avoid triggering their disdain. I spent my youth contorting myself into a smaller shape just to survive their transactional parenting model. I sacrificed my own comfort to ensure their profit margin remained wide and undisturbed. I realized the strongest position in any room is held by the person who does not need to rush to a defense. A defense implies that the attacker holds valid authority. It implies that their accusations carry weight and require a rebuttal. Brenda and Richard held zero authority over my life. Their judgments were as empty as the silver graduation box resting between us. They were simply 2 panicked thieves trying to execute a clumsy robbery in broad daylight. They were trying to steal a trust fund remainder by preying on the insecurities of a child they never bothered to love. I did not need to defend my right to exist in their family because I no longer wanted to be in their family. I set my water glass down on the white tablecloth. I placed it gently to ensure the ice did not clink against the crystal rim. I wanted my physical movements to project total serenity. I reached down to the floor and picked up my own bag. I unlatched the top clasp and reached my hand inside the main compartment. My fingers brushed against the smooth cardboard edge of the plain manila folder I assembled back in my apartment. The folder contained the truth. They spent years hiding, and the financial doom they spent months trying to evade. It held the letter of representation from my independent estate attorney. It held the 60-page distribution schedule of my grandfather's trust with the termination clause highlighted in bright ink. It held my original birth certificate listing Clara Bennett as my mother. I pulled the folder out of my bag and placed it flat on the table next to their fraudulent waiver. I kept my hand resting on the cardboard cover for a brief second. Richard watched my hand with growing suspicion. His eyes darted between the folder and my face. I turned my own manila folder, slowly making a precise half-circle motion on the linen cloth so it faced them directly on the table. The label on the top tab was now visible to my father. He could read the name of his own father's trust, printed in clean block letters. I was done waiting for their presentation. I was ready to begin my own audit. I did not raise my voice or make a dramatic scene. During my late shifts at the legal clinic, I learned that volume is merely a substitute for leverage. People who hold a losing hand tend to yell and slam their fists against tables. People who hold the winning hand speak softly and let the evidence do the heavy lifting. I opened the manila folder and extracted the 3 sheets of paper. I laid them side by side on the white tablecloth. I aligned the top edges perfectly, forming a neat row right next to his empty silver graduation box. It was the exact presentation method I utilized when guiding a wealthy client through the grim reality of their own audit. The first document was a letter of representation from my independent estate attorney. The letterhead featured the embossed logo of a boutique litigation group specializing in trust disputes. I watched my father's eyes dart to the thick black font at the top of the page. He recognized the name of the senior partner. He spent his weekends mingling with local corporate leaders at the country club, so he knew the hierarchy of the regional law firms. The color in his cheeks began to fade. He knew exactly what that letter signified. It meant I was not an isolated college student acting on raw emotion. I was a represented adversary. It meant his discount legal waiver was suddenly up against serious litigation firepower. He realized he could not intimidate me into signing a binding contract because an expert was already monitoring the transaction. The second document was the true prize of the collection. It was the distribution schedule of my late grandfather's trust. I had used a bright yellow marker to highlight the specific clause that terminated their caregiver payments on the exact date of my college graduation. I watched Richard shift his gaze to the second page. His reading speed slowed down to a crawl. He recognized his own father's precise legal architecture. Arthur Perry was a phantom who haunted Richard's entire existence. Arthur built a lucrative logistics empire through sheer grit, and he always viewed his son as a structural weak link. Richard spent his adult years trying to prove he belonged in the upper echelon of society, but he always knew he was wearing clothes his father purchased. That deep insecurity drove him to mask his incompetence with luxury cars and expensive restaurant reservations. Now the ghost of his father was sitting at the table with us, holding the deed to Richard's lifestyle. I let the quiet stretch across the booth while Richard read the highlighted text. His eyes tracked across the yellow ink. I saw his pupils dilate when he reached the word remainder. I saw his jaw drop a fraction of an inch when he saw my name printed directly next to that specific word. The physical transformation was immediate and severe. The blood drained from his face, leaving his skin a pale, sickly shade. He looked like a man who just checked his parachute only to find a bag of rocks. He realized instantly that his clever waiver was worthless. The math of his failure cascaded through his mind, and I watched him process the total ruin of his strategy. He and Brenda had spent thousands of dollars retaining a budget lawyer to draft a document cutting me out of their personal will. They aimed their expensive legal weapon at the wrong estate. They spent 6 months coordinating a psychological freeze and staging this elaborate lunch ambush. They executed all of this theater to protect a modest checking account and an underwater residential mortgage. They completely ignored the corporate trust that actually held the generational wealth. Their staggering arrogance blinded them to the public record. They assumed I was ignorant and pliant. Because of that fatal assumption, the real money was legally transferring to my personal accounts through a corporate bank in Philadelphia. As we sat there eating breadsticks, I thought about the sprawling colonial house they lived in. The property taxes alone required a massive annual layout. Without the monthly caregiver distribution from the trust, they could not afford the next quarterly tax installment. They could not afford the maintenance on Brandon's silver sports utility vehicle. The entire illusion of the Perry family success was tethered to my graduation date. They had driven me to this restaurant in a luxury sedan, fueled by the very money they were losing today. The algorithms at the corporate trustee office were already processing the final transfer. My university degree was verified by the registrar. The legal conditions were met. The wire transfer protocols were initiating, while Richard sat there adjusting his tie. That is the beauty of a well-drafted, irrevocable trust. It removes human error and human greed from the equation. The third document completed the narrative arc of their defeat. It was my original birth certificate. The official state seal was stamped in the bottom corner. The line designated for the mother listed Clara Bennett in clear type. I watched my father shift his focus to the third page. His brain was visibly struggling to process the influx of catastrophic information. The trust schedule destroyed his financial future, but the birth certificate destroyed his psychological leverage. Brenda loved to hold the secret of my adoption over my head in the dark. She planned to use it as a weapon to destroy my sense of belonging. The birth certificate neutralized her weapon. It proved I had already navigated the void of my own identity. I already knew the truth and I possessed the official paperwork to prove it. I did not gloat over the presentation. I did not point my finger at the pages or demand an apology. The paper spoke with an authority I did not need to vocalize. I watched Richard reach out a trembling hand toward the trust schedule. His fingers hovered over the yellow highlight, but he did not touch the paper. He knew touching the document made the nightmare real. He swallowed hard and looked up at me. The smug corporate negotiator was entirely gone. The man sitting across from me was a terrified dependent who just realized his primary source of income fired him. Richard possessed a unique tell when he was cornered by his own mistakes. I learned to spot it during my childhood whenever a local contractor demanded overdue payment or a credit card declined at a retail register. He would reach up and rub the back of his neck and suddenly complain about the temperature of the room. He reached up and rubbed the back of his neck. He tugged at the starched collar of his tailored suit. He was suffocating under the weight of his botched fraud. He looked at the waiver he had slid across the table just minutes ago. It looked pathetic resting next to the ironclad trust documents. It was a flimsy napkin placed next to a master blueprint. He could not speak. The linguistic center of his brain was paralyzed by the financial ruin staring back at him. He looked over at Brenda. His eyes were wide and frantic. He was silently begging her to intervene and fix the broken machinery of their plan. Richard was a man who required a script to function in society. He relied on golf handicaps and stock market platitudes to navigate his social circles. He never built anything from scratch. He merely occupied the comfortable spaces his father carved out for him. When faced with an original problem, he simply froze and waited for a rescue. Brenda was staring at the 3 documents, but she lacked the financial literacy to immediately grasp the severity of the trust schedule. She saw the attorney letterhead, and she recognized the birth certificate. She did not fully understand the legal implication of the word remainder. She only knew that her husband was visibly disintegrating in front of her. She recognized the scent of defeat, and it triggered her survival instincts. The conflict was shifting dimensions right there in the booth. Richard was effectively neutralized. The battle line was moving directly back to my mother. She studied my calm expression and looked at the steady hands resting in my lap. The realization of her failure began to penetrate her pride. She had brought me to this restaurant to strip me of my dignity and my future. Instead, I brought the receipts of her 20-year scam and laid them out in the open. The power dynamic inverted without a single raised voice. Brenda was about to process the reality of her new poverty and the presence of the real family sitting just a few feet behind her. I leaned back against the leather seat and waited for her to make her next move. My mother processed the reality a few seconds after my father. She lacked his technical vocabulary regarding estate law, but she excelled at reading human panic. She watched Richard collapse inward. She saw the blood drain from his face and the rigid confidence vanish from his shoulders. Brenda reached across the white tablecloth and snatched the 60-page distribution schedule right out from under his hovering fingers. She ignored the letter of representation and the birth certificate. Her eyes locked onto the bright yellow highlight illuminating the termination clause. I watched her read the paragraph. I observed the precise moment the cognitive gears turned inside her head. The complex legal jargon translated into a very simple and terrifying truth for her. She realized the sprawling suburban house they lived in was suddenly unfunded. The luxury vehicles parked in their wide driveway were unfunded. The expensive country club memberships and the lavish holiday vacations to Colorado were gone. The entire foundation of her pristine social identity evaporated in the span of 30 seconds. She read the word remainder and saw my name attached to the core fortune. The millions of dollars she spent 20 years circling were officially transferred out of her reach. Her empire of appearances was built on a stolen ledger, and the true owner just foreclosed on the property. The physical transformation Brenda underwent in that booth was alarming to witness. The glacial coldness vanished from her face. The predatory sneer she wore while calling me a useless asset dissolved. A desperate, frantic warmth rushed in to replace the ice. She possessed a terrifying ability to rewrite her own reality whenever her survival was threatened. When intimidation failed to secure her objectives, she immediately deployed victimhood and manufactured affection. I saw the muscles in her face soften. I watched her force a sheen of tears to gather in the corners of her eyes. She was attempting to erase the cruel woman sitting there 3 minutes ago and replace her with a wounded maternal figure. She reached her arm across the center of the table. Her manicured fingers bypassed the empty silver graduation box and the fraudulent discount waiver. She extended her hand toward mine with her palm facing upward. It was an open plea for physical contact. It was a gesture she had actively withheld from me for 2 decades. Whenever I scraped my knee as a child, or cried over a difficult exam, she always maintained a strict physical distance. She treated affection as a scarce resource to be hoarded. Now she was offering her hand like a lifeline in the middle of a sinking ship. Brenda leaned forward, and her voice trembled with a meticulously calibrated sorrow. She told me that pieces of paper did not define us. She whispered that legal documents and trust schedules did not change the fundamental fact that we were a family. She pleaded with me to remember the years we spent together under the same roof. She said money was just a complicated distraction, and that her love for me was the only thing that truly mattered. She asked me to hold her hand and figure this out together as mother and daughter. I looked down at her outstretched hand resting on the white linen. The diamond rings on her fingers caught the light from the restaurant chandeliers. I did not move my arms. I kept my hands firmly folded in my lap. I stared at her palm and analyzed the sheer audacity of her pivot. The same woman who just looked me in the eye and stated I was only kept around for the financial benefits was now pivoting to maternal devotion. She was declaring her unconditional love because the spreadsheets demanded it. The ledger showed a catastrophic deficit, and she was trying to balance the account using cheap theatrical grief. I experienced a brief memory from my junior year of high school. My Aunt Evelyn possessed a significant savings account, and Brenda wanted a short-term loan to remodel our kitchen. Evelyn was hesitant to part with the cash. I watched Brenda sit at our granite kitchen island and perform this exact same routine. She softened her voice and squeezed Evelyn's hand. She spoke about the enduring bonds of family and the importance of supporting blood relatives through difficult times. Evelyn wrote the check the very next morning. Brenda mocked her gullibility the moment the front door closed. I recognized the script. I was currently playing the role of the gullible relative holding the checkbook. I did not feel anger toward her desperate performance. I felt a profound sense of clinical detachment. I realized I was immune to her primary weapon. She spent my entire life withholding her approval to make me crave it. She assumed I would leap at the chance to finally receive her validation. She thought the promise of her maternal affection would compel me to overlook the 20-year fraud. She failed to understand that her approval lost its currency the moment I audited her motives. You cannot sell a counterfeit painting to an art appraiser, and you cannot sell counterfeit love to a forensic accountant. I evaluated my own standing in the world. I did not need the grandfather trust money to survive. The grueling overnight shifts at the downtown legal clinic yielded more than just investigative skills. The senior partners recognized my relentless work ethic and my ability to trace hidden assets. They offered me a full-time position as a junior forensic analyst, starting the Monday after graduation. I possessed a signed employment contract in my apartment. I secured my own residential lease without requiring a co-signer. I knew how to buy my own groceries and pay my own utility bills. I built an entire adult life out of the scraps they left behind. My survival was already guaranteed by my own labor. The true value of the trust remainder transferring into my name was not the purchasing power, it was the armor. The wealth provided an impenetrable shield against their future manipulation. Financial independence was the one variable Brenda could not control. She could not threaten to withhold my tuition. She could not leverage my housing. The money severed the final strings she used to operate the marionettes in her household. She was reaching across the table to grab a string that no longer existed. I maintained my silence. I let her hand sit empty on the table. The lack of a response forced her to absorb the rejection in real time. The tears pooling in her eyes threatened to spill over her cheeks. She was waiting for me to comfort her. She wanted me to apologize for causing her distress. The restaurant continued to hum with the polite chatter of wealthy patrons, oblivious to the silent implosion occurring in the corner booth. I leaned forward and initiated my exit. I did not snatch the documents in a hurried panic. I moved with slow, deliberate precision. I picked up the original birth certificate and slid it into the manila folder. I picked up the heavy distribution schedule and placed it behind the birth certificate. I retrieved the letter of representation and secured it in the back. I tapped the bottom edge of the folder against the table to align the papers perfectly. I closed the cardboard flap. Richard watched my hands pack away his financial ruin. He remained entirely speechless. The reality of his impending poverty kept him pinned to the leather seat. Brenda slowly retracted her empty hand. Her fingers curled inward as she pulled her arm back across the table. The mask of desperate warmth began to slip, revealing the raw, unfiltered panic underneath. She realized the negotiation was over and she secured zero concessions. I grabbed my purse from the floor and draped the strap over my shoulder. I slid across the smooth leather of the booth. I stood up and smoothed the fabric of my dress. The physical act of standing shifted the entire power dynamic of the space. For 2 decades, I was the small child looking up at the towering figures of authority. Now I was looking down at 2 defeated strangers sitting in the ruins of their own greed. I towered over their table, holding the manila folder against my side. I possessed the money, and I possessed the truth. They possessed a worthless discount waiver and an empty silver box. The business transaction was concluded. The severance they requested was officially granted, just not on the terms they anticipated. Brenda tilted her head back to look at me. The panic in her chest morphed into a frantic, aggressive energy. She could not accept the finality of my departure. She needed the last word. She needed to assert some fraction of control over my movements. Her voice rose above the ambient noise of the dining room. She commanded me to sit back down and finish the conversation. She demanded respect. Her escalating volume signaled the start of a new and highly public confrontation. She had no idea her audience was much closer than she thought. The air in the corner booth shifted the moment I stepped out of the leather seating and stood upright. My mother realized her performance of maternal sorrow had yielded zero dividends. The fake tears instantly vanished from her eyes. The desperate warmth she projected just moments prior evaporated, leaving behind the rigid and calculating warden I grew up fearing. Her maternal mask slipped and shattered against the floor of the restaurant. The familiar control snapped right back into her posture and her voice. She tilted her head back to look up at me. Her spine stiffened, and her jaw set into a hard line. She pointed a manicured finger directly at the empty space on the bench I had just vacated. She demanded to know where I thought I was going. Her tone lacked any trace of the gentle pleading she used when asking for my signature on the waiver. It was the exact same sharp dictatorial voice she used when I was a teenager arriving home 5 minutes past a curfew. She ordered me to sit back down and finish the conversation. She delivered the command with the supreme confidence of a woman who was entirely unaccustomed to being ignored. I looked down at the 2 people sitting in the booth. The contrast between my parents was stark. While Brenda attempted to reclaim her dominance through sheer vocal authority, Richard had already surrendered to the reality of his ruin. My father stared down at his empty hands resting on the white linen tablecloth. He looked entirely defeated. The leather portfolio he brought to execute my disownment lay zipped and useless near his water glass. He did not lift his head to support his wife. He did not issue a single command. Richard possessed a lifelong habit of retreating inward whenever his unearned privileges faced a legitimate threat. Years ago, when a minor labor dispute threatened a subsidiary of his father's logistics company, Richard locked himself inside his home office for 3 entire days. He refused to answer the telephone or speak to the attorneys handling the crisis. He relied on his father to navigate the legal battlefield while he hid behind a mahogany door. He was executing that exact same survival strategy right now. He could not lock a door in a public restaurant, so he simply locked his gaze onto his own cuticles. He retreated into a silent shell, hoping the catastrophic consequences of his fraud would somehow bypass him. He was a spectator at his own funeral. Brenda did not possess the ability to retreat. Her entire identity relied on her capacity to manipulate her environment. She required an audience to bend to her will. She leaned further across the table and lowered her voice to a dangerous hiss. She told me I was making a severe mistake. She promised there would be harsh consequences if I walked out of the dining room without resolving the estate paperwork. She was grasping at invisible strings, attempting to leverage a power she no longer held. She thought her anger was a weapon that could still inflict damage. She failed to realize her anger was merely a symptom of her own profound irrelevance. I stood tall in my graduation dress. I held the plain manila folder flat against my chest like a protective shield. The cardboard contained the legal proof of my financial independence and my biological origin. I did not feel the need to raise my voice to match her escalating volume. I did not feel the familiar childhood urge to shrink myself to accommodate her rage. I looked down at her face and recognized the desperate fragility hiding beneath her expensive makeup and her designer clothing. She was terrified. I decided it was time to introduce the final variable into her carefully constructed theater. The financial ambush was dismantled. It was time to dismantle her social isolation. She believed she possessed the upper hand because she assumed I was entirely alone in the world. She thought cutting me off from the Perry family meant casting me out into a void. She orchestrated this lunch under the assumption that her rejection was the ultimate punishment. I needed her to understand that her rejection was actually the catalyst for my rescue. I kept my breathing steady and my posture relaxed. I spoke in a perfectly calm and measured voice. The quiet delivery forced her to stop talking and strain her ears to hear my words over the ambient noise of the dining room. I looked directly into her eyes and delivered the summary of our 2 decades together. I told her that she and Richard only kept me around for the financial benefits. I paused for a fraction of a second to let the truth of that statement anchor itself in the space between us. I did not say it with malice. I stated it as an audited fact. Then I delivered the second half of the equation. I told her that my birth family kept a seat for me. The words landed heavily on the table. They struck with the density of lead weights dropping onto glass. The sentence disrupted the fundamental logic of her universe. Brenda blinked rapidly. Her mind struggled to process the terminology. The concept of a birth family entering the narrative was entirely absent from her risk assessment. She spent 20 years assuming my biological origins were permanently sealed inside a closed state registry. She thought my past was a locked vault she controlled. She had no idea I picked the lock 6 months ago. I did not give her time to formulate a defense or issue a denial. I raised my chin and directed her attention to the geography of the room. I told her that my real family was sitting in the row directly behind her. The revelation suspended the oxygen in the booth. Brenda stopped talking mid-sentence. Her mouth remained slightly open, but no sound emerged. The aggressive posture she assumed a moment earlier froze into a rigid statue of shock. The threat of consequences died on her tongue. The reality of her exposure hit her nervous system like a physical impact. She spent the last hour delivering a masterclass in psychological abuse. She smiled while calling me a useless asset. She attempted to defraud me out of a generational trust fund. She performed all of this calculated cruelty, believing she enjoyed absolute privacy. She thought the surrounding diners were just wealthy strangers absorbed in their own expensive meals. I watched the horror dawn behind her eyes. She realized the audience for her betrayal was not composed of anonymous strangers. The audience consisted of the very people who gave me life. Brenda possessed an obsessive compulsion regarding her public image. She spent her adult life meticulously curating the perception of her flawless suburban household. Before we attended Sunday services at our local church, she used to inspect my clothing and rehearse our family entrance in the foyer. She demanded we smile on cue and project an aura of serene prosperity to the congregation. The idea of being caught executing a greedy disownment in a public space was her ultimate nightmare. The knowledge that she was caught performing this exact act in front of my biological mother was a level of humiliation she could not fathom. Her silence stretched for several long seconds. Even Richard finally looked up from his hands. He registered the sudden shift in the atmosphere. He looked at his wife and then followed my gaze toward the back of the restaurant. Brenda began to turn around slowly in her chair. The movement was agonizingly precise. She did not whip her head around in a sudden panic. She rotated her body with the cautious dread of a person turning to face a predator in a dark room. Her silver cashmere shoulders shifted against the dark leather of the booth. The fabric gathered and folded as she twisted her torso. She gripped the edge of the white tablecloth with one hand to steady her balance. Her knuckles turned white from the pressure. I watched the back of her head as she completed the rotation. The dining room around us seemed to quiet down in anticipation. A waiter carrying a silver tray paused near a nearby pillar, sensing the heavy tension radiating from our corner. The ambient clinking of silverware faded into a low hum. The stage was perfectly set. Brenda completed her slow turn and her gaze landed on table 4. The small brass number gleamed under the soft overhead lighting. She faced the reality she tried to erase 22 years ago. She was looking directly at Clara and Beatrice. The people who had spent my entire life waiting to welcome me home were sitting right there watching the woman who tried to throw me away. Brenda completed her rotation and stared directly at table 4. The dining room lights cast a soft glow over the small brass number resting between the water glasses. Clara and Beatrice had been sitting there the entire time. They arrived early and ordered modest side salads and iced tea to ensure they secured the location without drawing the attention of the waitstaff. They sat in quiet observation for the last 45 minutes. They heard the zipper of the leather portfolio. They heard my father rehearse his corporate disownment speech. They listened to my adoptive mother deliver her engineered cruelty and call her own daughter a useless asset. My adoptive mother subjected Clara to a rapid visual appraisal. Brenda possessed a habit of scanning strangers and instantly calculating their social worth based on designer labels and expensive jewelry. She looked at the simple navy cardigan Clara wore. She noted the lack of a luxury handbag resting on the adjacent chair. She evaluated the modest styling of my biological mother, and her face registered a brief flicker of elite disdain. Brenda always believed wealth equated to superiority. She assumed anyone lacking a high net worth also lacked fundamental power. She failed to recognize the profound danger sitting across from her. Clara did not wear expensive silk, but she possessed an unshakable poise. Clara spent the last 22 years working in public health care. She navigated chaotic hospital wards and managed grieving families on a daily basis. She understood human fragility, and she recognized emotional manipulation the moment she heard it. Clara spent 2 decades wondering if the wealthy family chosen by the adoption agency provided a loving environment for the child she surrendered. Sitting in this restaurant and listening to the transactional disownment answered that question with brutal clarity. She realized her agonizing sacrifice was exploited by 2 greedy opportunists looking for a tax shelter. Despite hearing the woman across the room abuse her biological daughter, Clara did not react with theatrical outrage. She did not gloat over my financial victory. She did not point a finger or say a single word to my adoptive mother. Clara understood that raising her voice would only pull her down into the gutter Brenda occupied. She simply looked at the woman holding onto the edge of the leather booth. Clara offered a gaze of quiet dignity mixed with profound pity. She looked at Brenda the way a person looks at a tragic accident on the side of a highway. It was a look that stripped away the country club facade and exposed the pathetic reality of a woman who placed a price tag on a human soul. Brenda tried to maintain her fierce eye contact, but her confidence buckled under the weight of that silent judgment. She searched the face of the woman sitting at table 4 and saw the undeniable biological truth. She saw my jawline and my eye color staring back at her. The visual confirmation paralyzed her vocal cords. She opened her mouth to issue a demand or hurl an insult, but her lungs refused to push the air forward. She was a stage actor who forgot her lines right as the curtain lifted. Beatrice shifted her weight and initiated the next sequence of events. She picked up her white cloth napkin from her lap and folded it into a precise square. She placed the linen neatly next to her iced tea glass. Beatrice was a small woman, but she commanded the physical space around her with a gravitational pull. She spent 30 years running a public school cafeteria where she managed hundreds of unpredictable teenagers every single afternoon. She possessed a supernatural ability to spot a bully from 50 yards away, and she knew exactly how to neutralize them. She did not fear the wealthy socialite trembling in the corner booth. Beatrice placed her hands on the edge of the wooden table and pushed her chair backward. She stood up. She straightened her floral dress and lifted her chin. She did not offer a polite smile. She established a physical barrier between her family and the predators sitting a few feet away. By standing up, Beatrice issued a silent declaration of ownership. She was claiming her granddaughter in front of the people who just tried to throw me away. Clara followed her mother's lead. She pushed her own chair back and stood up next to Beatrice. They stood together in the soft lighting of the restaurant. They did not beckon me with frantic hand gestures. They simply waited. They stood there to welcome me just like you stand for someone arriving at an airport gate after a long and turbulent journey. They provided a safe harbor in the middle of a hostile environment. The atmosphere in the restaurant underwent a sudden and undeniable shift. High-end dining rooms thrive on a strict code of polite ignorance. Wealthy patrons are conditioned to ignore the minor arguments occurring at adjacent tables. They focus on their expensive wine and their curated appetizers. But the magnetic pull of this silent confrontation forced the surrounding strangers to pay attention. The low hum of conversation faded away. A waiter carrying a silver tray full of roasted vegetables stopped walking mid-stride. A couple sitting near the front windows lowered their wine glasses and watched the scene unfold. The quiet was thick and electric. I took a breath and stepped away from the edge of the leather booth. The physical act of moving my feet severed the final invisible tether binding me to the Perry household. I held the manila folder containing my birth certificate and the trust documents firmly against my side. I turned my back on the empty silver graduation box and the fraudulent waiver. I began the short walk toward table 4. The distance between the two tables was approximately 15 feet. It was a negligible physical measurement, but it felt like crossing a vast border between two entirely different dimensions. I was walking out of a territory defined by transactional currency and entering a territory defined by inherent value. Every step echoed slightly against the hardwood floor of the dining room. I walked past my father first. Richard remained frozen in his seat. He kept his head bowed and his eyes fixed on the white tablecloth. He could not meet my gaze. He lacked the courage to witness my departure. He was already drowning in the terrifying reality of his impending poverty. His corporate arrogance was reduced to ashes by a highlighted paragraph on a trust schedule. I walked past him without breaking my stride. I felt no lingering attachment to the man who treated my existence like a quarterly earnings report. I walked past my mother next. Brenda was still twisted around in her seat facing the back of the room. Her hands gripped the leather upholstery with white-knuckled intensity. Her mouth remained slightly open in silent shock. She watched me walk away from her and move toward the women standing at the adjacent table. She spent my entire life dictating my physical movements and controlling my social interactions. She used to dictate where I sat during family dinners and where I stood during holiday photographs. Now she was a helpless spectator watching her ultimate prize walk directly into the arms of her replacement. I reached table 4 and stopped in front of the empty chair. Clara stepped forward and placed her hand on the wooden backrest. She pulled the chair out for me. The wooden legs scraped softly against the polished floorboards. The sound felt like a formal invitation. She offered a warm and genuine smile that reached all the way to her eyes. There was no calculated choreography in her expression. There was no invoice attached to the seat. I sat down in the chair and placed my manila folder on the table. Beatrice sat down next to me and Clara returned to her own seat across from us. The transition was seamless. I was no longer an isolated asset fighting a desperate defensive battle in a corner booth. I was a protected member of a unified front. I felt the tight coil of anxiety in my stomach release for the first time in 22 years. The silence in the restaurant lingered for a few more seconds. The surrounding patrons watched the quiet resolution and slowly returned to their meals. The waiter resumed his path toward the kitchen. The ambient noise of clinking silver and low voices began to swell back into the room. We sat at table 4 and shared a look of mutual understanding. The financial ambush was dismantled and the emotional severance was finalized. But the conflict was not entirely extinguished. I knew Brenda possessed a dangerous inability to process public defeat. She relied on the illusion of control to sustain her ego. Watching me transition to a new family, while holding the legal rights to her lifestyle, was a psychological injury she could not absorb in silence. I kept my eyes focused on Clara, but I listened to the sounds emanating from the corner booth behind me. I heard the rustle of silk fabric sliding across leather upholstery. I heard the sharp intake of breath. The initial shock paralyzing my adoptive mother was wearing off, and the public humiliation was rapidly transforming into raw rage. She was preparing to break the silence. I sat down in the wooden chair at table 4 and allowed my spine to relax against the firm backrest. The physical sensation of safety washed over my shoulders and traveled down to my hands. For my entire life, the concept of family was tethered to a constant state of nervous anticipation. I was always waiting for the next criticism or the next arbitrary punishment. Sitting across from Clara and Beatrice felt like stepping off a turbulent ship onto solid ground. The air around our table was calm. There was no hidden agenda lurking beneath the surface of their expressions. They looked at me with genuine relief and quiet pride. I placed my hands on my lap and focused on the steady rhythm of my own breathing. Behind me, the heavy leather seating of the corner booth groaned under sudden pressure. The sound was sharp and disruptive. Brenda was no longer capable of sitting in the ruins of her failed ambush. She pushed her body upward and stood tall in the middle of the dining room. Her silver silk blouse caught the light from the overhead chandeliers. The pristine fabric starkly contrasted with the raw panic distorting her facial features. She gripped the edge of the white tablecloth and leaned forward. The polished silver graduation box toppled over and struck a water glass. The ice spilled across the linen and pooled around the fraudulent legal waiver. She ignored the mess. She fixed her eyes on the back of my head. Brenda possessed one defining asset she valued above her bank accounts and her luxury vehicles. She valued her public composure. She spent decades carefully constructing a flawless social persona in the affluent Pennsylvania suburbs. She hosted charity galas and directed neighborhood committees with an iron grip. She trained herself to speak in measured tones and to project an aura of effortless superiority. She mocked women who displayed messy emotions in public spaces. She viewed any loss of emotional control as a fatal weakness indicative of low breeding. She built an entire empire on the premise that she was untouchable. Watching her lose that composure was like watching a load-bearing pillar collapse under a heavy roof. The realization that her financial supply was severed and her biological replacement was sitting 15 feet away triggered a catastrophic system failure in her mind. The sophisticated matriarch evaporated. The desperate, frightened woman beneath the silk blouse clawed her way to the surface. She opened her mouth and the velvet restraint she maintained for 20 years vanished. She started yelling. Her voice cut through the sophisticated ambiance of the restaurant like a harsh siren. She did not use a hushed whisper or a passive-aggressive remark. She projected her anger across the dining room with reckless volume. She demanded that I turn around and acknowledge everything she sacrificed for my existence. She yelled about the roof she provided over my head. She screamed about the expensive education she supposedly funded. She listed the meals and the clothing and the basic necessities of my childhood as if she were reading an overdue invoice to a delinquent client. Her accusations echoed against the mahogany walls and the high ceilings. She detailed the humiliation she was enduring in this restaurant and blamed me for orchestrating her downfall. She framed herself as a benevolent savior who rescued an unwanted child from obscurity. She broadcasted the adoption to the entire room, hoping the stigma would somehow shame me into compliance. She wanted the wealthy patrons sitting at the surrounding tables to view me as a treacherous ingrate who betrayed a generous benefactor. The absurdity of her screaming about educational expenses was profound. She was standing in front of dozens of witnesses demanding gratitude for a college degree I financed through my own grueling overnight shifts at a legal clinic. She was demanding recognition for a house funded entirely by my grandfather's trust distributions. She was attempting to rewrite history loudly enough to make it true, but the sheer volume of her panic only exposed the hollow core of her narrative. She sounded like a frantic investor watching a stock portfolio crash to zero. The reaction of the restaurant patrons was immediate and severe. High society dining relies on a strict covenant of invisible boundaries. People pay premium prices to enjoy their meals in insulated peace. Brenda shattered that covenant. Heads turned at every single table. A man in a tailored charcoal suit sitting near the front windows lowered his wine glass and stared openly at the corner booth. An older woman wearing pearls paused with her fork halfway to her mouth. The polite hum of background conversation died instantly. The silence that replaced it was heavy and judgmental. A waiter carrying a silver tray, loaded with roasted vegetables and prime cuts of meat, froze in the center aisle. He stood paralyzed between our two tables, unsure if he should retreat to the kitchen or attempt to intervene. The restaurant manager emerged from behind the host stand. He smoothed his lapels and began walking briskly toward the back of the room. The establishment was accustomed to handling minor disputes over wine vintages or seating arrangements. They were not equipped to handle a matriarch experiencing a vocal breakdown over a severed trust fund. Richard tried to mitigate the disaster. He remained seated in the booth, but he reached his hand upward and grabbed the fabric of his wife's sleeve. He tugged at her arm and muttered a frantic warning. He begged her to sit down and lower her voice. He reminded her that people were watching them. Richard always feared public scrutiny more than he feared private failure. He knew their social standing was fragile, and this outburst was destroying whatever residual dignity they possessed. Brenda ripped her arm away from his grasp. She shook off his hand with a gesture of pure disgust. She was beyond the reach of his passive management. She looked down at him and sneered. She was furious that he failed to secure the legal waiver, and she was furious that he was cowering in the booth while she fought to reclaim their stolen authority. She turned her attention back to me and escalated her tirade. She pointed her finger at table 4 and yelled that I was walking away from the only people who ever cared about my future. I did not turn my chair around to face her. I did not raise my voice to meet hers. Engaging in a shouting match would only validate her delusion that we were participating in a mutual argument. We were not arguing. I was simply existing, and she was malfunctioning. I kept my posture relaxed, and my gaze focused on the center of my own table. I allowed her to burn through her oxygen and exhaust her final reserves of intimidation. Clara observed the spectacle unfolding behind me. She did not display any fear or anxiety. She possessed the steady calm of a veteran nurse evaluating a patient experiencing a severe crisis. She understood that the screaming woman was not a threat but a casualty of her own greed. Clara shifted her posture and reached her hand under the wooden table. Her fingers found mine, and she offered a firm, reassuring squeeze. Her skin was warm and her grip was steady. She did not speak a word. She simply held my hand to tether me to the present reality. The physical contact grounded me. It reminded me that the noise behind my back belonged to a past I no longer inhabited. Beatrice maintained a similar posture of quiet defiance. She folded her hands on top of the table and watched my adoptive mother with a detached, analytical gaze. Beatrice spent decades managing cafeteria logistics and handling volatile personalities. She recognized a temper tantrum regardless of the designer clothing the person wore. She did not flinch when Brenda yelled. She merely tilted her head and observed the self-destruction of a bully. The presence of these two grounded women created an invisible fortress around our seating area. The sound waves of the screaming crashed against our table and dissipated without causing any structural damage to my resolve. The wealthy onlookers populating the dining room quickly reached their own silent consensus. Human nature is remarkably perceptive when evaluating a public conflict. Every person in that restaurant observed a calm young woman sitting peacefully with people who clearly adored her. They simultaneously observed an older woman standing over a spilled water glass, screaming about money and financial sacrifices. The visual contrast required no translation. No one ever listens to a parent screaming about financial investments and assumes that is where the real love lives. Love does not itemize its expenses in the middle of a crowded room. Affection does not present a bill for services rendered. The patrons recognized the harsh transactional nature of Brenda's outburst. They saw the predatory foundation of her parenting. By demanding public sympathy, she inadvertently broadcasted her own sociopathy to her peers. She was digging her own social grave with every word she shouted. The restaurant manager finally reached the edge of the corner booth. He was a tall man with a stern expression and a measured stride. He stepped between our tables and addressed Brenda in a low, authoritative tone. He asked her to lower her voice immediately and reminded her that she was disturbing the other guests. He offered to escort her to a private office near the front entrance to resolve whatever issue was causing her distress. He treated her like a disruptive patron who had consumed too much alcohol. The intervention of the manager acted as a cold shock to Brenda's system. The authoritative reprimand pierced through her rage. She blinked and looked around the dining room. For the first time, she processed the dozens of eyes staring directly at her. She saw the judgment carved into the faces of the affluent diners she spent her life trying to impress. She saw the disgust in the eyes of the man in the charcoal suit. She saw the pity radiating from the older woman wearing pearls. The reality of her public exposure crushed her remaining defiance. The color drained from her cheeks and her shoulders slumped forward. She looked down at the white tablecloth. The legal documents were gone. The silver box was empty. The ice was melting across the linen. She realized she lost the trust fund and the daughter, but more importantly, she lost the flawless reputation she curated for 2 decades. She slowly lowered her body back into the leather booth. She slid into the seat next to Richard and stared blankly at the ruined table. The silence returned to the restaurant, but it was a different kind of quiet. It was the heavy, exhausted quiet that follows a severe storm. The ambient noise of the dining room gradually resumed as the patrons returned to their meals. The manager gave a curt nod and walked back toward the host stand. I looked at Clara and offered a small, tired smile. Her thumb brushed gently against the back of my hand under the table. Beatrice picked up her glass of iced tea and took a slow, deliberate sip. We survived the ambush, and we weathered the fallout. The Perry family was officially relegated to the background of my life. I knew the legal logistics of transferring the trust remainder would require my attention the following morning, but for this specific moment the battle was over. I was sitting at a table where I belonged, and nobody was keeping a ledger. The manager stepped back and allowed the silence to settle over the dining room. I looked at Clara and Beatrice and knew it was time to leave the stage. I pushed my chair back and stood up. I did not look back at the corner booth. I left the fraudulent legal waiver resting on their table next to the puddle of melting ice. That piece of paper was a souvenir of the exact day their funding expired. It was a physical receipt of their failed scheme. I carried my manila folder and walked out of the mahogany doors into the warm Pennsylvania afternoon. The humid air felt entirely different in my lungs. I was breathing as an independent entity unburdened by the heavy ledger of their expectations. The transition of wealth occurred the following Monday morning. It was a clinical and efficient process devoid of any emotional theater. I sat at my small kitchen counter and dialed the direct phone number for the corporate trustee in Philadelphia. A trust officer verified my identity and requested a certified copy of my university transcripts. I submitted the digital records through their secure portal. The officer confirmed the receipt of my bachelor's degree and read the termination clause aloud over the phone. The caregiver distributions payable to Richard and Brenda Perry were formally canceled. The remaining millions held within the principal accounts were unspooled and transferred into a secure portfolio under my exclusive control. The entire transaction took 14 minutes. 22 years of suburban manipulation ended with a few keystrokes on a banking terminal. I poured a cup of coffee and watched the digital balances update on my computer screen. The numbers represented security, but they also represented justice. I spent the next 6 months observing the predictable collapse of the Perry household from a safe distance. I did not hire a private investigator or stalk their social media profiles. The world of affluent suburban real estate is remarkably small, and gossip travels fast among local law firms. My position as a junior forensic analyst at the downtown clinic granted me access to public filing databases. I occasionally checked the county records during my lunch breaks. The financial decay of their lifestyle followed a very standard trajectory. People who live beyond their means on a subsidized income rarely possess the discipline to adjust their spending habits when the revenue stops. Richard and Brenda attempted to maintain their pristine facade for the first 90 days. They continued to dine at expensive restaurants and attend country club events. They relied on their modest personal savings to bridge the gap left by the missing trust checks. They assumed they could secure a private loan or manipulate a bank into extending their credit lines. The reality of their situation arrived in late October when the annual property taxes for the colonial estate became due. The tax assessment was a heavy burden they used to pay effortlessly using my grandfather's money. Without that specific revenue stream, the tax bill became a lethal threat to their solvency. The public records showed a sudden desperate listing on the local real estate market. The sprawling house with the renovated kitchen and the manicured lawn was priced to sell quickly. They could no longer afford the basic maintenance required to keep the property viable. Within 6 months, the people who raised me were forced to downsize their entire existence. They sold the colonial home and moved into a generic townhouse development 3 towns over. The new residence lacked the grand foyer and the impressive circular driveway Brenda used to project her superiority. It was a stark architectural demotion. The country club suspended their membership due to unpaid monthly dues. The luxury sedans were quietly returned to the leasing dealerships and replaced with practical economy vehicles. The empire of appearances crumbled because the foundation was built on stolen timber. My brother Brandon faced an even harsher awakening. He spent his entire youth operating under the delusion that he was a wealthy heir immune to the consequences of his own laziness. He treated his university classes as optional suggestions and spent his weekends destroying expensive sports cars. When the trust distributions terminated, his personal funding evaporated overnight. Richard and Brenda could no longer absorb his debts or pay his exorbitant credit card bills. For the first time in his life, the golden child received a decline transaction notification. Brandon was forced to draft a resume and enter the actual workforce. He lacked any specialized skills or meaningful internship experience. The corporate connections my father used to boast about suddenly vanished when the country club membership was revoked. Brandon secured an entry-level position selling mobile phone contracts at a retail kiosk inside a local shopping mall. The biological son who received catered birthday parties and imported gifts was now wearing a polyester uniform and standing on his feet for 8 hours a day. The universe possesses a remarkable sense of balance when artificial safety nets are removed. I never filed a civil lawsuit against Richard and Brenda. I possess the legal standing to sue them for the misappropriation of the caregiver funds over the last decade. My senior partners at the law firm reviewed the trust documents and confirmed we could likely extract whatever modest assets they had left. I chose not to pursue litigation. Suing them would require depositions and mediated settlement conferences. It would force me to sit in conference rooms with them and listen to their desperate rationalizations. Litigation is a form of ongoing relationship, and I wanted a permanent divorce. I also refrained from posting my victory on social media. I did not write a lengthy expose detailing their abuse or publicly shame them in front of their suburban peers. True power does not require an audience. I simply enforced a boundary of absolute silence. I changed my phone number and updated my email addresses. I blocked their accounts across every digital platform. I became a ghost. Ghosting a narcissist is the heaviest punishment you can inflict. They feed on attention and conflict. By removing myself entirely from their radar, I starved them of their primary emotional resource. My new life evolved in quiet, beautiful increments. I moved out of my cramped studio apartment and signed a lease for a bright, spacious loft closer to my office. I furnished the space with pieces I selected myself, rather than relying on clearance rack cast-offs. I focused on my career and earned a reputation as a relentless analyst who could track hidden assets through the most complex corporate shields. My employers valued my insight and rewarded my labor with tangible promotions. I was generating my own success without needing a corporate trustee to validate my worth. The most profound change occurred on Sunday afternoons. I established a standing weekly appointment with Clara and Beatrice. I would drive down to their small house in the Philadelphia suburbs. The structure was modest, but it was filled with warmth and genuine history. There were no pristine white tablecloths or silver-wrapped boxes containing empty air. Beatrice would bake bread, and Clara would brew strong coffee. We sat at a worn wooden kitchen table and talked for hours. We did not discuss trust funds or estate law. We discussed literature and local politics, and our favorite cinematic landscapes. I learned that Clara shared my dark sense of humor, and Beatrice possessed my exact analytical gaze when evaluating a problem. I slowly unlearned the defensive behaviors I acquired in the Perry household. I stopped anticipating an invoice for every cup of coffee they handed me. I stopped calculating my utility in the middle of a conversation. I realized that real family dynamics are not structured like a balance sheet. You never have to audition for a seat you already deserve. The analytical portion of my mind often reflects on the nature of deception. The people who raised me believed they could outsmart the inevitable. They thought they could suppress the truth by controlling the flow of information and isolating the target. They failed to understand that the truth is patient. It does not need to rush or scream to make its presence known. It sits quietly in county archives and sealed envelopes, waiting for the exact moment it is needed most. It arrives on graduation days and shatters 20 years of careful manipulation in a single afternoon. 6 months after the lunch at the restaurant, I received an unexpected email at my corporate work address. The sender name made my pulse pause for a fraction of a second. It was from Brandon. He managed to track down my professional contact information through a legal directory. The message was poorly formatted and riddled with grammatical errors. He bypassed any polite greetings and immediately launched into a frantic request. He stated that his retail wages were insufficient to cover his rent, and he needed a temporary bridge loan. He invoked the concept of shared history. He actually typed the phrase stating, "We are still blood, and we need to stick together." The irony of his request was staggering. The golden child who mocked my clearance rack sweaters was now begging the discarded adopted sister for a financial bailout. He conveniently forgot my biological origin the moment his own bank account reached zero. The Perry family only recognized bloodlines when it served their profit margin. I leaned back in my office chair and considered my response. A younger version of myself might have felt a twinge of guilt or a desire to rescue him. A spiteful version might have drafted a lengthy reply detailing his hypocrisy. I channeled my training as a forensic accountant. I replied to his email with a single attached PDF document. It was a standard commercial promissory note. I filled in the requested loan amount, but I applied a prime interest rate and included a strict clause requiring physical collateral exceeding the value of the loan. I stated that if he could produce the required assets, I would consider underwriting the agreement. He did not reply. He possessed no collateral, and he understood the cold, unyielding logic of the document I sent. I treated his request with the exact same transactional detachment his parents used to raise me. It was a fitting conclusion to a relationship built on commerce rather than care. I closed the email application and returned to my pending casework. I built an architecture for my life based on mutual respect and genuine affection. The foundation is solid because it relies on the people who show up without an agenda. I spend my days dismantling the financial lies of wealthy strangers, and I spend my weekends enjoying the unvarnished truth of my real family. The ghosts of the Perry household no longer haunt my decisions. I left the transactions behind forever and stepped into a world where my existence is enough.